Good morning, everyone. Before we begin,
早晨大家，
I want to introduce our two amazing community-based interpreters here with us today, Ken Fong and Kai Lui. Ken and Kai, would you please introduce yourself to our Chinese-speaking participants and provide them with instructions on how to access the translation channel?
早晨各位，我係 Ken 方，係今次大會嘅廣東話翻譯。我嘅拍檔 Kai Lui 隔離嗰個，亦都係廣東話嘅翻譯。
又好多謝阿 Ken， 咁佢已經講咗啦，我係Kai Lui係另一個啦，係傳譯員㗎。咁而家我哋或者啦係先講下大家咧，如果選擇呢一個啦中文台啦點樣做法？咁咧就如果你係用電腦嘅話咧，咁你咧就喺你入咗嚟 Zoom 之後咧，你見到底下咧有一個地球嗰個公仔啊，咁你咁咧就 click 咗嗰個公仔，按咗嗰個公仔啦，入去選擇中文，咁你咧就入咗去呢一個中文台啦。Ken。OK，
咁假如你係用手機嘅話咧，咁你就喺嗰個手機嘅右下角見到有3個白點，咁你按佢一下之後咧，又係見到嗰個地球嘅公仔，咁你就喺嗰度選擇 Chinese 即係中文啦。咁如果你唔想聽背景係有20% 係英文嘅咧，咁你就將嗰個原來嘅英文嗰個台咧就將佢刪咗佢，咁然之後咧就喺右上角嗰度按一按嗰個燈，即係完成啦，咁你就入咗嗰個台啦。
Okay, back to you, Mr. Borden.
Well, thank you, Ken and Kai. I also just want to take this opportunity to remind all of our distinguished guests to please slow down a little bit so that our interpreters can keep up and that all of our guests can follow.
咁佢話咧就請嗰啲啦講者啦。
That our monolingual Chinese-speaking attendees are able to participate as fully as possible.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say that we're having a slight bit of technical difficulties. So we are going to take a brief pause momentarily, and we will be back in just one moment. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you so much for being here.
因為技術故障嘅問題咧，咁我哋暫時要休息一陣，咁就好快脆就會恢復呢個大會㗎啦。
Who served your table, cooked your food, harvested your sugarcane. We have worked your canneries, picked your crops, built your railroads. You claim war against trade agreements, blame us for deadly COVID imported from China. Call it the China virus, the Kung flu. Incite more race hatred. It's madness. You beat us with baseball bats, jail us in concentration camps. You kidnap our women and sell them as sex slaves, garment workers. You tell us to go back where we belong. Call us enemy aliens. You rip our children from us and cage them like animals. You lynch us, run us out of our homes. You call us Jap chink, slope, tonto, flip, spit, spook, raghead to cage our humanity. The hate crimes rise, killings keep mounting, madness. But we stand against your sickness. We'll stop the spread of your bigotry. Look about you and see all our mouths. We will not be driven out because of your hate. We will tear down the walls of fear and build bridges of love. We know all acts of compassion are victories in our war for justice. We defy your lies, ignite the light of truth in our throats. We stand up against violence. We are not alone. We won't dwell in your cages. It's our form of madness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice, for those powerful words. They couldn't be more timely. They couldn't speak more directly to the fear and anxiety and the passion and the progress that we need to make as a community. It's really just so horrific that we need to focus our art and our culture on reminding people of the daily suffering and indignities. But we do, and we're lucky to have you, Janice, to channel the fear and the energy and the passion and the beauty of our community that we're all feeling in this moment, and to recognize the need for progress. So thank you for that very powerful poem. Now I'm deeply honored to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable Justice Goodwin Liu. Justice Liu is an Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. Nominated by Governor Jerry Brown, Justice Liu was unanimously confirmed by the Commission on Judicial Appointments and sworn into office on September 1st, 2011. He was retained by the electorate in 2014. Now, before joining our state's highest court, Justice Liu was a professor of law and an associate dean at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. There, his primary areas of expertise were constitutional law, education law, and policy, as well as diversity in the legal profession. The son of Taiwanese immigrants, Justice Liu grew up in Sacramento, where he attended public schools. He went to Stanford University and earned a bachelor's degree in biology in 1991. He went on to attend Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship, a few years ahead of me, and he earned a master's degree in philosophy and physiology. Upon returning to the United States, Justice Liu went to Washington, D.C. and helped to launch AmeriCorps, a national service program. And he worked for 2 years as a senior program officer at the Corporation for National Service. Justice Liu graduated from Yale Law School in 1998, becoming the first in his family to earn a law degree. After law school, he clerked for the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Liu, thank you.
Thank you so much, District Attorney Boudin. It's a pleasure to be with all of you.
Our panelists on panel one could please turn on their cameras and microphones, and Kelsey, if you could please begin recording and streaming to Facebook Live, that would be great. I'll just give folks a moment, and then looks like we're set up. I see we're live. Thank you, everyone. Now, as everyone just heard a few moments ago, Justice Liu spoke about the importance of having a unified and collective voice for the Asian community. And while that is important, as we discussed, the AAPI community has also been very vocal about the fact that it is not a monolith, it is not a single community or identity or language. Rather, our Asian American and Pacific Islander community encompasses a tremendously and proudly diverse set of cultures, nationalities, identities, languages, and religions, and more. And because of that diversity, we have community leaders here who work with very different populations within the broader AAPI community, who can speak to us about the impact of the increase in hate incidents on the communities they serve. So let me start by briefly introducing each of our distinguished panelists. We have with us today Annie Chung, the Executive Director of Self-Help for the Elderly. Self-Help was founded in 1966, well before I was born, here in San Francisco's Chinatown, and it now serves over 40,000 seniors all across San Francisco. Also with us on this panel today is Sarah Wan. Sarah is the Executive Director of the Community Youth Center. CYC, or the Community Youth Center, have centers throughout San Francisco, including a renovated clubhouse in Chinatown, and they serve approximately 8,000 youth and families all across the city. A third guest on this panel is Boryai. Boryai, also known as PJ, is a community advocate with the Asian Prisoner Support Group. His family escaped violence in Cambodia, and he was born in a Thai refugee camp. Shortly after arriving in California as a young child, he survived a mass shooting at the hands of a white supremacist who had entered his elementary school, specifically targeting Southeast Asian refugee children. He committed a crime at the age of 14 and spent 20 years in prison, longer than he'd been alive up to that point. Now that he's come home to his community, to our community, he spends his time serving the community and the broader AAPI community, in particular, Cambodian elders, and educating the community about the real harms of racial violence and bullying. Also with us today on this panel, we have Orchid Puse, who is the Executive Director of the Asian Women's Shelter and a partner with my office in a wide range of projects, as all the speakers are. The Asian Women's Shelter was founded in 1988 to address the needs of women, children, and transgender survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, with a particular focus on those survivors who are immigrants or refugees. Also with us on this panel is Assembly Member Ash Kara. Now, I know we're a little ahead of schedule, and so Ash has not joined us yet. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him with the knowledge that he'll be able to join the panel a little bit later once we've gotten started. It's great that we're running ahead of schedule, but it does mean one of our panelists has not yet been able to log on, but we're working on getting him here. And while we do that, I'll just remind folks about Assemblymember Kalra. He represents California's 27th district in the state legislature. That district encompasses about half of San Jose. And Assemblymember Kalra is actually the first Indian American in the California legislature. And he is one of the authors of the Racial Justice Act, new law that went into effect this year. And the purpose of this law was to seek to eliminate and root out racial discrimination within the criminal justice system. It's an ambitious goal and one that will no doubt require a tremendous amount of effort and collaboration from all of us. But this law was aimed at moving the ball and the conversation forward on that issue. So let me start with a question for PJ. There have been a few high-profile cases involving young Asian American or Pacific Islander victims of hate crimes. And I know that you experienced this yourself, a really horrific, violent hate incident when a white gunman entered your school in Stockton, California, and killed 5 Cambodian and Vietnamese school children and injured many more, children that were your classmates, friends, people you went to school with. Can you describe in a bit more detail, PJ, what you experienced and the impact that traumatic experience had on you in the time and perhaps continues to have in your life and in your work today?
Thank you, District Attorney. for the introduction and for navigating this whole process. Really appreciate you and your work. Just kind of think, even before the incident of the school shooting, I kind of want to go back a little bit. I think my experience and the message I got of being a Cambodian person living in the United States started with our resettlement, right? My family are refugees. We were escaping genocide. And I came here when I was 5, and we resettled in a very impoverished community with a lot of violence, a lot of trauma. You know, most of the community members who live where I lived at the time were also like survivor of the genocide in the Khmer Rouge. And so there was a lot of trauma being passed on from generation to generation. And it was like a disconnect, right, between the elders and the young folks. And I remember like going to school, you know, trying to fit in. Obviously, I came from another country, so I didn't speak the language and I didn't understand the cultural, and I couldn't fit in with the other kids. You know, like they didn't want me. I knew I was different, right? I knew I was different because they would tell me you're different. And I remember my experience, you know, like even with the older folks who actually, older white folks, older Black folks would always tell me like, you know, you don't belong here, and like go back to your country. And I remember like being spit on just simply because I didn't understand the culture and simply because I didn't speak the language, right? Because they didn't want me. And I think, you know, like having a hard time fitting in with the other kids, I'm starting to receive the message, you know, like the message like I'm not wanted, right? And I started to question my own value as a kid, like do I matter? Like obviously I'm getting these reinforcement on a daily basis, and then the school shooting was a moment will really change my life forever, because that is the moment where I got the message very loud, very clear that I'm not wanted. And I was on the playground with my friend Rith at the time, and we heard the sound of what we thought was firecracker. And, you know, like for us, you know, kids at the time, when you hear firecracker, you get excited because that means it's time to celebrate, you know, like something is happening. And so we ran towards the sound of the firecracker. And to our horror, it turns out to be, you know, the sound of an AK-47 being fired onto the school ground yard from a rooftop. And I remember seeing people, seeing my cousin, seeing my classmates, seeing other people I know from the neighborhood and I have played kickball with on the playground, like they started falling. And then I remember seeing their blood on the ground. And I froze. And in that moment I froze. And it seemed like a lifetime. It seemed like a very, very long time, because I was just honing onto these images that's never really left my head till today. And my friend Riff shook me. He said, "It's time to go." And as we were running away, I'm starting to hear the sound of gunfire, like, you know, aiming across my head. And then in that moment, we were able to escape. You know, we ended up picking up a kid who was actually shot in the leg, and we dragged him as he was limping to the bathroom, which, you know, is a lot of concrete. So we thought that was the safest place until one of the janitor told us to just drop the kid and run. And so we dropped him and ran, and the janitor picked up the kid. And I never knew the kid's name. I never knew what had happened afterward to him. But that day, that moment, you know, like the next day, even I came back to school, and you could still see blood on the playground. You could still see the bully hole in the concrete wall. You know, I shut myself out completely at the time. I said, you know what, I'm not wanted, right? They don't want me here. And I think the compound of that experience, and then being bullied later on because, you know, because I was Asian, because the older kid didn't, you know, found me like amusing, right, as a target for them. And so that led me, you know, to gangs. Gang was my safe haven. I joined a gang when I was really young because I wanted the protection, because I wanted to feel accepted, right, to feel like I mattered. And, you know, in the lifestyle of the gang, it leads you to crime, and it leads you to incarceration. And so at age 14, I was convicted of second-degree murder, while in the commission of a robbery, because I wanted to impress my friends, my older friends, and now end up in prison. And, you know, like in prison, you see separation, right? You should see, you see the Asian on one side, the blacks on one side, the Hispanic on one side. And so it's always this message of like, we're separated, right? And I'll start focusing more on my own trauma and the trauma of my own people. And I'll also like really focusing on myself, but never really understand unity, never really understand community working together, what that really meant, right? Because I grew up really, really isolated in a community that was isolated, that didn't trust outsider. It wasn't until I got to San Quentin and this community, the irony is that San Quentin has this history, this story about the violence, about a tough place to be, but they turned it to this flagship of programming. So a lot of people there was doing program, they were going to school, they were getting a college degree, they were becoming counselor, they were getting trades. And I remember what stuck out to me the most was that people all were together. There was no separation, there was no isolation. The community worked together. We sat in school together, we sat in programs together, we did project together, right? And today, like some of my best friends are black and some of my best friends are white and some of my best friends, of other nationality other than Cambodian. And we have done so many good things. We started programs together. We raised funds, for the communities. We did food sale and fundraising, walkathons. And it was this huge message that together, in solidarity as a community, we can accomplish a lot, and because of those environment and because of those message that I started to see differently than when I was a kid, I accomplished a lot. I went back to college. I became a counselor. I helped pass legislation. Like we did a lot of good things, and then because of it, I earned my freedom. I think like today, I chose the path of advocacy work, of working with my community, mentoring the kids, working with nonprofits who believe in unity, believe in healing, believe in uplifting API community, and providing us like an opportunity to move forward in a big way that will benefit our community and benefit our family. And today, like I spent so much time, working in my capacity to try to help my community, but it's a gift. I think it's a gift that was given to me, and it's a gift that I need to give back, right? And so today I want to focus on the message of unity, right? Because I think I've learned, through my journey, even through my own trauma as a kid, all the way to now, like I learned that the only way we make our community better is coming together. Because like all these messages I see in social media now, all these hate and all these, like I think fueling those fire has created more trauma and created more pain. And so for me, I want to focus on bringing community back together, being a role model and a mentor. Like I don't want to see my nephew, like hitting a black kid or hitting a white kid. I want their experience to be different than mine, because I grew up in a community where they say, don't trust black folks, don't trust white folks, right? And that led me to some really dark places. And so I want to imagine a world where we all can feel safe, like our kids can feel safe. Because I didn't grow up in an environment where I felt safe.
PJ, thank you so much for sharing. I can only imagine, and I can see the pain that talking about that experience still brings with it for you. And I think it's a really critical reminder for all of us as we do this work, and certainly for me and for my office, that we can prosecute crimes, we can hold people who commit crimes accountable, we can have physical injuries on victims heal, but the trauma will last a lifetime. I also want to follow up with you, PJ, because a couple of the things you said for me kind of raised additional questions, and I want to just hear you if you're up for it, explore a little bit further. Two things. One is, it sounds to me like your experience as a child watching that kind of violence and experiencing that kind of targeted racism is part of what led you into committing crimes yourself, seeking out, as you described it, kind of an identity, a place of belonging within a gang that led you to end up committing a crime yourself. And I know that in our office, in San Francisco District Attorney's Office, we see a really large number of people who are crime victims in one case and who are the people we've accused of committing crimes in another. In other words, many of the people we provide victim services to, we've also prosecuted. And there is that connection between trauma and people who experience trauma who then go on to cause harm. So I wonder if that's something that you experience or you could reflect on. And then secondly, and related, you described the ways in which within the prison system itself, there was segregation based on race or identity. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about maybe the irony of sending people who commit horrific hate crimes into one of the most intensely segregated spaces within our broader society.
You know, through my journey in prison, I've learned, I took a transformation in my life, and I wanted to continue to heal from the trauma, and I took a lot of programs. And one of the things I've learned is this saying, they call it hurt people. And then there's also another saying that said heal people, right? And so when people who often is hurting will always end up hurting someone else. And for me, like, I've learned to be accountable for my crime. I learned to acknowledge what I've done and the pain I've caused, because even though I have experienced pain, I've created pain also. And so I think there's a way of acknowledging my accountability. So I did my time, and and at the same time, I wanted to give back, right, to correct what has been done. And I think but I think like moving forward in growth and healing comes from the opportunity to do so, right? Like I didn't have the opportunity, like to learn differently, right? So I imagine like if I work with youth now, and I work with at-risk youth, and we tell them, like we work with them. Some of them have already even committed a crime and they're going to courts. And I think like learning to teach people how to heal from their past experience, and then providing an opportunity to move forward. Like I believe in restorative justice. So I think like creating a platform where it's more restorative. And then I think the restorative practices and learning to connect with one another. Like I learned to connect with people in the group that I work with. Like I didn't know this Black guy was experiencing some of the trauma I experienced. To me, I thought that was an Asian thing, but I've learned as they shared, or as this white guy shared, his story was similar to mine. I mean, it looks different, but the feeling of helplessness, the feeling of fear, the feeling of pain was like, it's the same. I think as we learn to connect with each other's pain and each other's experience, that way we can begin the healing. And I think moving forward is, to break racial tension, to break borders and barriers, is like we learn to help each other heal rather than isolating one another to our own experience. And so I think in prison, that's what it taught me. It taught me like I can be accountable. And I think like someone who has been harmed, and the person who have harmed someone should be accountable. But it also like the person harmed somebody because they have also been harmed. I think that needs to be healed also, right? Because I think like creating more pain in the community doesn't solve the community problem. It's just perpetuated. And I use this as an example. I'm hearing this because someone have asked me this question before. It's like why should they invest in programming, for folks who have harmed somebody? Well, most of the time, the same people who's harmed somebody who is doing time will eventually get out to the same community, and they are not learned and have not healed from their trauma. They're going to continue to reoffend and harm someone else. So I think like investing in healing, investing in rehabilitation, investing in opportunity, right, rather than investing in punishment, is the key, I think. Right, I want to imagine people who has done wrong have an opportunity to deal with the trauma, and then give back to the community, because that's the way to be accountable. Right, I think accountability is a big piece in this whole thing, and I say that we all are accountable to ourselves and to our community in some way or another.
Thank you for that, PJ. Really appreciate your perspective and your experience. I want to bring in another voice at this time. I want to bring in Assemblymember Ash Kalra, who has joined us. And I want to ask Assemblymember Kalra, kind of following up on PJ's story, which I think really reminds us of the need to understand the impact of acts of violence that we're seeing today in a historical context, to recognize that what's being experienced today is not a new phenomenon. It's something we're more acutely aware of, and that in many ways has become more normalized and widespread. Assembly member, I know you have also talked about the concept of othering and how that perpetuates division and in many ways brought us to the challenges that we're facing today. What is it in your view about the racial nature of these acts that makes them more harmful than the underlying act of violence or hatred?
District Attorney Boudin, great to be here with all these incredible panelists. And the reality is that the use of othering as a tool of division has been existent in this country from even before its inception. And so it's not an accident that even to this day, we're still seeing, and to PJ's point, talking about being incarcerated, he actually had a chance to learn more about the folks that were with them every single day, whether they were Black or white. He saw similar trauma. And the reality is that when that trauma manifests itself in a way that acts out against any particular group, that's painful. It hurts. It is something, and we're seeing the pain in the API community in a very real way. And so I do think that there needs to be a recognition, but I also think that you have to dig deeper as to why it's happening, because ultimately when I'm looking at this past year, and obviously it's been quite a year, but a lot of the anti-Asian hate really started with the former occupant of the White House and those that followed him and to this day follow him. China flu, Kung flu, is continuing the messaging that Asian Americans are an other, that we need to be fearful of, that we need to be angry towards, that we need to blame. And so even to this day, a lot of the incidents and the crimes that are happening are rooted in that white supremacy that has been with us from day one. When we're looking at, certainly those of us that are Asian American, no matter when we came here, we all had different obstacles to face in terms of being the other. And even to this day, there's an unwritten, unspoken loyalty test, even as elected officials, that we have to somehow show, yes, we're American, like our loyalty is to this nation, is to this community. And the reality is, even more recently, when you look at, and the reality is that if you're looking at the crimes that have been happening, especially towards our elders, which have been just brutal and horrific, and there's this effort to try to other those that might be perpetrating the crimes, and in particular those in the Black community. And the reality is that the root of the anti-Asian hate is rooted in white supremacy, but so is the othering of the Black community. And this, since before the inception of this nation, this sense that somehow that if someone's Black, they have more violent tendencies or more dangerous. That's something that's been ingrained in this society for hundreds of years. And so I think we have to acknowledge that the right response to those that other us isn't to other people. That sounded confusing, but I hope it made sense, is that we really need to get to the root cause, while at the same time recognizing the real pain that is being caused in the community. And that's why, as the API caucus, we're pushing for $200 million right now on a variety in the budget over the next 3 years to fight hate crimes in different kinds of ways. More than half of the money would go for grants to nonprofit and community groups that provide legal services, healthcare, mental health, victim compensation, or counseling, as well as those that provide education on systemic racism, escorting our elders that are not feeling safe at the moment. And so really taking a more holistic view of what's happening in the community, and not just saying this money needs to go to law enforcement, because at the end of the day, when that's your only tool, it never solves the problem. It's in the history of the country has shown that. It's really the deeper involvement and depth in the work in the community of kind of breaking down the othering that occurs in our community as to the roots of it. And we also have resources going for hate crime hotlines, because I think we're seeing an increase. We're also seeing an increase in reporting, which is a good thing. We want people to report when they're victimized. That's always been a problem in the API communities. The API community don't feel comfortable coming forward seeking help. And now if the trauma that's been caused over the past year at least leads to that, that's a silver lining, which is a good thing, that at least we can get help to those that need it and to those that are victimized. And so in any case, I think that we absolutely need to highlight hate crimes, but we have to do it in a way that I think has much more depth than just, okay, we have to get more police officers on the street, lock people up, send them away. That doesn't solve the underlying issues, even though we absolutely need to create safer environments as well.
Thank you for that, Assembly Member. And I want to kind of follow up with something that's maybe a little bit closer to home, but I think ties into the conversation we're having today and your comments about othering. We're all navigating this COVID-19 pandemic. It's part of, we know what's been the kind of, the spark for this wave of anti-Asian hate in the United States. We're also seeing other countries around the world navigate the COVID pandemic with very different outcomes and very different resources. And I know your family is from India, you have family in India, and India is one of the countries right now globally that is the most impacted in this moment, most devastated by COVID and by lack of access to resources, basic medical supplies. Could you talk a little bit about both the situation in India today, but also how you see it in a global context tied to the kind of day-to-day hatred that so many Asian Americans are experiencing here in the Bay Area?
Well, yeah, that's a really good way to look at some of the issues we're facing. They aren't isolated to the United States. These are global issues where you can definitely see even the response to the pandemic, where the vaccines are going, where the help is going, whether it's those that are struggling in Mexico, in India, in Africa. It's really the colonial power, so to speak, historically, the ones that are getting the resolution more quickly, getting the vaccines more quickly, and those that, and it's interesting because India has provided most of the world's pharmaceuticals. They produce them. They produce a lot of the painkillers, a lot of the different types of treatments and medications that have been critical, especially in the early stages of COVID, to relieve and allow the doctors to treat patients. And so it's been really sad to see what's happened in India. There's a lot, India, it's a massive country, right? It's a massive country with massive poverty, literally, tens of thousands of villages, massive, some of the largest metropolitan areas in the world. And so my aunt and my family, a part of my dad's family lives in Lucknow, which is the biggest city in the biggest state, Uttar Pradesh in India. She got sick a few weeks ago, like 2-3 weeks back. And she had issues, breathing issues. They don't think it was COVID, but it was something that required oxygen for her treatment. And it may have been COVID because a lot not being diagnosed as COVID, but they couldn't get a hospital bed. They couldn't get oxygen on the private market, and she died at home untreated. And so this is hitting so many Indian Americans, South Asians that are here. And I think that we have to recognize that if we're going to, on a global scale, especially as we're seeing America diversify more and more immigration on a global scale, if we're going to continue to do things the way we've always done, then the same countries and the same people that have suffered will be the ones that continue to suffer. And it's interesting because you see this kind of race to the top in terms of large economies, whether it's Germany or China or India competing with the United States. And yet, again, to some of that othering, it's typically the ire from politicians on both sides of the aisle goes towards China. And that's a major problem as well. That why are we just targeting this one economy? Granted, it's a very large economy, but the same thing happened back in the 80s with Japan, right? And even though Germany, France, England have massive economies, the EU has a larger economy, in total, than any of those other countries. And yet that feeds into what happens when you're in a pandemic and there's a response, when there's a military issue and there's a response. And so there's so much, angst because, India has given so much over the last, year over year to try to help other countries. And in its time of need, it's hard to see how much suffering is going on. It's massive. The numbers are massively undercounted in terms of COVID deaths because they're only counting the deaths that are in the hospitals. Like I said, my aunt never got to the hospital. A lot of bodies are just being taken straight to be cremated, and they just write down illness. They don't even say what the illness is. And so it's a catastrophe. It's a global crisis. I just hope that we recognize that, we shouldn't be playing, and this, I know it sounds naive on the surface, we shouldn't be playing politics, when it comes to dealing with pandemic, but it's all been politics. And it's been based in much part based upon long-standing hierarchies in the global economy.
Thank you for sharing that, Assemblymember, and for reminding us of the ways in which the local is global and in which even things as basic as healthcare and social inclusion can become politicized. And we know that's true in many instances, as you've just described in India, right here at home as well for our most vulnerable community members in particular. And so I want to turn now to another panelist, Annie Chung. I think one of the things that really stands out for me and for so many of us watching with horror and trying to step up and take action in the face of some of these hate crimes and hate incidents is that many of the ones we see are targeting our most vulnerable community members, right? A lot of the high profile cases, not just in the Bay Area, but across the country that have been aired on TV involve not just Asian victims, but elderly Asian victims, some in their 80s or 90s. So Annie, I'm wondering if you can describe for us how the elderly population that you serve is feeling right now, and what sort of impact these crimes and these news stories sensationalizing these crimes have had on the daily lives of the community that you serve.
Thank you very much, Chesa, for bringing us together. I think the conversations like the one today at the summit are very, very important, particularly when it seems like at least the elderly are being targeted for these really heartless and very cruel attacks. I want to share a real victim story with all of you. I asked for permission already to just let you know how fearful our seniors are really right now, because almost every day you hear of incidents of hate hurting our most, as you said, vulnerable population. So thank you very much for inviting me to your panel. Mrs. Chan, she's not as elderly as the 85-year-old or the 75-year-old, but now wearing masks and, you know, our older generation, when you go out, people are targeting them anyway. She's in her mid-50s. So on Mother's Day of all days, taking the bus to work in the morning, as a perpetrator, a person was getting up and she had no idea, you know, the person was coming at her. She was sitting in the middle section of the Muni bus, and she was punched right in the center of her face. And then the person got off the bus. She was shocked. Yeah, she told me that her mind, her brain just went blank. She couldn't feel anything. She knows she was bleeding. And then there were people on the bus, Chesa, but nobody came to her aid, not even handing her a tissue. The bus was stopped. The bus driver stopped and got everybody out of the bus. She climbed down the bus, kind of dazed, crying, you know, painful, but her mind was totally blank. Someone called the police, maybe the driver. She herself, when she came to, sat at the bicycle rack close by and also called 911. And the police came, I think that within a few minutes, 5-10 minutes, and took the report. So this case was fully reported, right? But she called me on Mother's Day after she got home crying. Her son was living in San Jose and couldn't get back to her. And she also had to continue to go on to work. She's an IHSS person and felt that she couldn't leave her senior, right, not being attended to. So I kind of just want to share with you that most of our seniors are feeling the fear right now, and the victims are feeling even worse. And then all the family members are going through all this really traumatic experience, and they, as everyone else that has been, what has been happening in our community, really need time to heal. So that's a very important message right now, is if you have any elderly parent or grandparent or neighbor, please call them, you know, call them up and talk to them, and making our seniors feel that somebody, you know, is thinking about them and also caring for them. So that's very important. Collectively, Chesa, the news story, I feel there are pros and cons. Definitely, the Asian voice against hate crimes and hate incidents like this just have to stop. They must stop, because it really not a fight against particularly ethnicity or Asian group or Asian Americans. It really is a fight that we all have to be part of to stop these viruses and crimes against our humanity. If our country, if society, if all of us doesn't reflect these values of hate and racism, then we must stop these crimes. We must do whatever it can, whatever it takes. So our seniors' stories are being told not just on the news media, but also on a lot of social media, right? And then they became viral. And then the family members would usually send it to their loved ones and say, now don't go out, don't leave the home now, because it's very dangerous outside. And the unintended consequence to asking all your loved ones to stay at home and not go out is really not good for their mental health. And then they also have to go out, right, for essential trips to the banks and whatnot. So after all these incidents started, our mayor gave us some money to jumpstart the senior escorts program. And already we have received over 80 requests, mostly escorts to the doctor's appointments, but also some to the banks. And this would at least provide a little bit more protection for our senior members. But the news story, of course, highlight, right, the importance that these incidences are happening to the AAPI community. And every elected officials, like yourself, every department head of the city and County of San Francisco, everyone must just do our part to stop these hate incidents. And then these stories, while they're good on one hand to bring up awareness, but it's also bringing attention also to the vulnerable seniors, because we were told that many of these perpetrators have mental disorders. They are mentally ill. But why are they attacking mostly elderly members? I took a look at the recent report, Chesa, on the Stop AAPI Hate Crime. Since March in 2020, that we were steadily climbing, right? About 3,800 crimes and incidences. But now, as of March of this year, 2021, it already have gone up to 6,600 incidences. So that's like 10x a day. And the news are reporting 1 or 2 or 3, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're seeing it as if, but in the nation, it's more than 10x a day. And we know that it's very much underreported, right? It could be double the number. So I think that with this, we have to use our best judgment about these news stories. And yes, it is important to build awareness. That's why there's an outpouring of support from almost every sector, every community, wanting to help and wanting to volunteer with the seniors, whether escorting them, bringing them to the market, like walking in the park, giving them some company. But also, if there are very violent stories, I would not just send it out, to all of your network for it to be passed on, because then people thought that these incidences are happening every day and more times a day. So, but I do feel that a lot of the times the AAPI community were told that we are quiet, we don't report crimes, we're not vocal. But this time is showing that the AAPI communities are really united in engaging the mainstream media as well as our ethnic media to call attention to all of these hate incidences that are happening. And maybe by working together with the media, you know, with you, with the SFPD, with the mayor's office and our supervisors, we could come up with a more holistic plan in how to address, just like Justice Liu say, there are root causes to this racism and attacks. And we have to find a way really to put our arms around it and to stop them.
Annie, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to emphasize a couple of things from the story you shared at the very beginning of your answer. You know, we need to help each other. We cannot see people being attacked or bleeding and do nothing.
Yes.
That is not who we are individually, collectively, as a city. We support each other. We stand with each other. If we see something, we speak up, we say something. So please report crimes in progress, call 911. Don't just make a video for social media, call for help. And if you see someone who's been hurt, stop and help them. This is not about promoting vigilante justice. This is about notifying the police so that they can respond to a crime in progress, so they can investigate, so they can present my office with evidence that we can use to make charging decisions and move cases through the criminal legal system. But speaking of reporting, Annie, one of the issues that I want to just briefly follow up with you on is language access.
Yes.
You know, today we have amazing interpreters working with us. I want to again acknowledge and thank our interpreters for their work today. In your experience, Annie, does San Francisco do an adequate job providing language access? When people call 911, is it easy to communicate in the language that they speak, or is that an area where we as a city need to improve?
I think that San Francisco have done quite a bit for language access of providing it, at least in the tier 1 major departments, right? Like yours, like the police department, like the health department or HSA. Many of us, many in the community work on the language access issues like Chinese for Affirmative Action, Sarah's program, many of us. And we do go to OSEA to get language interpreters for our naturalization workshops. So I'm sure that when a lot of the budget town hall meetings are happening, they were all kind of translated in the 3 languages, right? Which is Cantonese or Chinese, and then Tagalog, and then Spanish. So just I think that there always room for improvement. We get real stories of really people going into your tier 1 departments and still not getting adequate help for their language needs. And of course, you could use language lines, but they're never as efficient and as effective. Like we have Ken and Kai directly, instantaneously reporting or translating what is going on to actually get more monolingual community to be what we call engaged with what's happening around their city and their own community. Calling 911 is actually not that easy. Recently, Lisa and Peter and Kitty and I worked with HSA to come up with a door hanger, right? A door hanger with a lot of safety tips on it. And your staff wanted us to put down, after calling 911 in your native language, Peter thought that it's really important to then also teach people how to report to 911 because they usually get so traumatized that they go into immediately, the incident that they were facing. And then they have to listen to the operator to give addresses and there's some very specific information. So I think there's a lot of community education work still to be done by your office as well as some of us in the community to make language access more available, more accessible, and more easily, more user-friendly. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And I know we continue to work to improve language access. It is a challenge, and it's also a goal for me and for my team and for the entire city. So thank you for helping to work with my staff to hold us accountable to all of the community members that you serve. I want to turn now to Orchid. And Orchid, one of the things that we've noticed in the district attorney's office and that has gotten some attention, but probably not nearly enough, is the intersectionality between racism and misogyny, the ways in which a lot of the incidents we're seeing are targeting not only people who are Asian or Asian American or Pacific Islander, but also people who are women. We've certainly seen across the country a spike in domestic violence. We know that human trafficking continues to be a major issue, impacting disproportionately people from Asia and Asian ancestry. What we see, not just in San Francisco, but even if we look across the country, for example, to the mass shootings in Atlanta, I think there's a clear connection between race-based hatred and gender-based hatred. Orchid, could you talk a little bit about this issue and how the recent situation across the country has impacted survivors of gender-based violence within the AAPI community?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this with such an invested group of people. So again, my name is Orchid. Orchid in English, it's Pulan in Mandarin. And I guess I'll start with just saying that, misogyny and hatred of women is now more and more recognized as a foundational value of white supremacy movements. And I think part of our work is recognizing that and knowing that it is a foundation in pretty much all of our communities. It's just that with gender-based violence, with domestic violence, a lot of times the harassment, the harm, and the murder happens within the community as opposed to across, which means that it's a lot harder for communities to come together around when compared to violence that targets your entire community, with the targeter being someone who looks different, speaks different, eats different, etc. So I would just say that this spike in hate violence against our communities has had a really, really deeply unsettling impact on the survivors of violence that we work with at Asian Women's Shelter in San Francisco. And this really is about local, national, and global intersections of gender-based violence and hate violence. And just a quick introduction, Asian Women's Shelter we've been here in San Francisco since 1988, supporting survivors of domestic violence, family violence, and human trafficking since opening our doors. And we're here primarily for immigrant and refugee and asylee communities, especially people who don't speak English, speak limited English, and who, as a result, when things are terrible, terrifying, when things have reached the end of the line, these people have nowhere to go where someone might understand, no phone to pick up, to call, to have someone on the other side who speaks your language and is ready to support you through these types of situations. That was such a reality in San Francisco that a huge part of our population had nowhere to go and nowhere to call. And so AWS opened to address that gap. And I want to talk about really how domestic violence and hate violence have some similarities. We don't get to talk about them together very much, but both of these types of violence, they strip away our sense of safety in the places where we really need to feel it the most. And I mean need really at like a physical health, mental health, brain chemistry kind of way. So in our homes, with our family, and then extending beyond that in our schools, our workplaces, and our neighborhoods. And eventually, as PJ talked about, the sense of belonging that we need actually in our state and our nation. So, domestic violence, yes, it tends to happen within cultural communities. Hate violence, yes, it tends to happen across cultural communities, but both kinds of violence aren't random, and that's what's terrifying about it. These kinds of violence target people a specific person, a specific family, or a specific group or look of people. And they're both about this entitlement and this dominance over that person or that group of people. And, you know, I really want, even though I know that it can be really hard for different parts of our communities to hold all of this at once, I've been at AWS since 2001 as an hourly Mandarin advocate, and then since 2002 as staff. And this is the content that is like in my bones. This is what I care about so much, because I want everyone in our community to have safety so that they can have the opportunities that our one human life is supposed to have in it. And Asian women have been being hurt and killed predominantly, first and foremost, by men in their own families. And all kinds of studies are being done finally in the last 10 years and 40 years to show this, to highlight it for people who don't have the lived experience and need to have the data back up. So, you know, in San Francisco, for example, from 2018 through 2019, half of the domestic violence homicides were of Asian women. Asian women have been targeted locally, nationally, and globally, as you said, in Atlanta, across the nation and across the world, in peacetime and in wartime, that Asian women have been really seen as servants on the one hand, as prostitutes on another hand, people that men in their own communities are entitled to, people that rich families are entitled to, people that sex tourists are entitled to, people that deployed military are entitled to, people who were categorically excluded from entering the US by the Page Act in the 1870s before the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 80s. And we have to care about all of that collectively. And I believe that we can, or I would have left my job. I believe that we can to care about this devastating hate violence and all of the violence that is impacting Asian women and children and elders and all. And I, you know, I am here for that. Asian Women's Shelter isn't going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere. And in the meantime, we just have a kind of a rougher time building in and doing all the empowerment work that we do with people here locally, supporting people to survivors of violence to feel empowered using public transit, to go to a workforce development workshop, to go to a job interview, to pick up and drop off their kids on their own, alone, to just go outside for fresh air as part of trauma recovery, to make new friends. All of these pieces of independence building and empowerment are part of work to address domestic violence, and they're deeply hampered by hate violence that's going on right now. I'll stop there.
And let me thank you for that, Orchid. Let me ask a quick follow-up, which is, you know, when my team of prosecutors considers whether to file a hate crime charge or allegation in a case, we're looking for specific proof that the underlying crime, whether a robbery or an assault or whatever it may be, was motivated by the victim's protected identity. In recent conversations, there's been an assumption that if a victim is Asian, that we should be considering hate crimes allegations based on that Asian identity. It may surprise some folks that actually a couple of the cases where we have filed hate crimes allegations involving Asian victims, the protected identity was not that they were Asian. The basis for the hate and for the targeting was not their Asian identity, but rather their gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder again, if you could just talk about how these things intersect in the context of hate crimes and whether we need to complicate the narrative in the media and within law enforcement. So we're not just looking at race, but also gender, sexual orientation, and so on.
Right. Agreed. Check. No, I'm kidding. I I mean, I think that sometimes, because I've been at Asian Women's Shelter for almost 20 years, it's like all of the stories and the experiences, they overlap with each other, and they're all about the exact intersection you just talked about. All of them. And I think that, you know, what we always want to do is, as Asian Women's Shelter, is to support all of us to do a better job thinking about all of the different parts of somebody and how those different parts can be experienced as vulnerabilities, and how they can be exploited, really. So this happened, you know, in the aftermath of the Atlanta massacre. I think, just for me personally, that week, right after, I mean, really that night, as soon as it hit the news, then of course, all of the feeds that I'm a part of just start going wild. And meanwhile, I'm part of so many collaboratives, so many for domestic violence, for gender-based violence, for trafficking, for Asian communities, for queer Asian communities, for Asian women communities, for children, so many. And the thing that I found really hard, that I spoke about in some of those settings, was that Atlanta got talked about and picked up as an Asian issue. It is an Asian issue, but it wasn't only an Asian issue. It was also about a women's issue, and namely an Asian women's issue. And sometimes when I talk about intersectionality, this is a little weird, but I talk about combo pizzas. When you get a combo pizza, and some of us eat combo pizza, some of us don't. Some of us think cheese on a big piece of bread is revolting, but Pizza Hut, it took them 20 years almost to get a customer base in China, but it exists now. So I'm going to use pizza. When you have a combo pizza, it's not that one slice is mushroom, one slice is onion, one slice is sausage, one slice is pepperoni. It's all mixed together. When you take a bite, you don't get one bite of mushroom and one, it mixes, it's dynamic, it's a combo. So Atlanta is about not just an Asian situation of hate violence, not just a situation of violence against women, and the violence particularly that comes from this toxic masculinity position of, I am entitled to you, and if you reject me, your life is at stake. It's all of it put together. And we can, again, I believe, move forward together in holding that complexity and not lumping things wrongly into single categories or single issues or single identities. And I have to, this is terrible because I have so much more to say, but I actually am the one person on our panel that has to sign off early because I have to speak at another engagement that was set forever ago. So I have to sign off and thank all of you so much for speaking, to thank our DA and our DA's office for putting this together and being really deeply engaged in this complex and painful conversation so that we can do something to move forward with it instead of just sit in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Orchid. Thank you for your word and thank you for your work. And we'll look forward to continuing to work together. I want to now bring in Sarah Wan. And, you know, we've in some ways come full circle. We've talked about, starting with PJ, we've talked about his experience growing up, experiencing violence and hate violence when he was a kid. We've talked with Annie about the elderly. And of course, we had Justice Goodwin Liu's words about his own experience as a child. And so now I want to ask you, Sarah, you know, this is something we actually have not seen in the media recently. We haven't seen coverage about acts of violence targeting younger members of the AAPI community. And yet, I think we know from the words of the other speakers that the entire community is impacted by the violence and the hate incidents. And so I want to ask about bullying, particularly targeting AAPI youth. And this is an issue that drew a tremendous amount of attention some 10 years ago during the Obama administration, when a presidential task force revealed that about 2/3 of Sikh youth were victims of bullying in Fresno, California. In New York, half of AAPI students in over 100 schools reported experienced some kind of racial bullying. And so, Sarah, I know you work with this population, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what it looks like here in San Francisco and what our younger members of the community are experiencing in the context of this broader wave of discrimination.
Thank you, Chesa. Again, thank you for having me on this panel, especially talking about how this pandemic and also how this anti-Asian hate incidents have affected our youth community. Most of the panel I'm sitting on, they're asking us about the victim support services, and youth were never really brought to the highlights unless it's at the school district level. So I'm really glad that I will be able to actually talk about how really impact our youth community in San Francisco here. I'd like to start with some statistics. So I think a lot of people heard about the statistics about the Stop AAPI Hate Project. They actually also have uprising the youth voice, where a group of youth leaders also come together in 2020 and also launched the Stop AAPI Hate Youth campaign. And in that campaign, they actually interviewed 990 young adults across the United States about the experience and feelings related to racism during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think some of the key findings might give us some ground about how it really affect our young people. About 8 out of 10 AAPI youth, which is like 77%, they have expressed anger over the current anti-Asian hate in this nation. And 6 out of 10 also expressed disappointment over racism. AAPI youth who experience racism firsthand more likely to be concerned about their family. About 30% of them also saddened than their peers who didn't. AAPI youth also care deeply about anti-Asian hate because they believe any form of racism is wrong. 34% of them thinking that blaming one group for COVID-19 is incorrect. And I think at CYC, we also actually did a survey with about 300 youth last year and another 300 youth this year with our API youth participants. Over 60% have expressed a higher level of distress and anxiety since the pandemic, not only because of distance learning due to the learning loss, but a lot of them related to isolation, fear, emotional distress, and mental health struggles. So it really a very alarming statistics. And because the school hasn't reopened, we actually don't know how it would be like when they return to school. And from very first hand, I teach parenting class every Friday at CYC. I actually asked the parents, school is about to reopen. Are you open to let your kids going back to school? 80% or more parents tell me they will not because of virus, because they worry their kids will be bullied. They worry their kids will face racism at school, and they know they may not report either because they fear retaliation, they don't know how to deal with this situation, they don't feel safe, or they don't know how to report, or they don't even know if people care. So this is very alarming and very saddening for many of our frontline staff. So for our frontline staff at CYC, I'll have to say that we really have to shift our focus for our youth leadership group. We also noticed that even though they are sheltering in place at home, our youth doesn't mean that they are safe. They still face bullying incidents online with the online platform. So from the Stop API campaign report, they actually show a quarter of the reported incidents occur on virtual platforms, including TikTok, Instagram, Yubo, and they have never really reported those incidents. Many of you have expressed to us they feel like they no longer feel like they belong to America, whether they're American born or they're immigrant. And of course, for the immigrant community, they definitely feel a lot more traumatized or fear because that they have the cultural and also language barriers that they don't know really how to deal with the situation. We have really adjusted our program to increase workshop on like safety awareness, basic self-defense, bystander intervention, hope that we can provide better support to our young people. We also, again, it's very important to fostering a very safe space for our youth voice so that we could advocate and empowerment and show them how to bring this awareness of this issue in our community to across different diverse communities. I think for today, we, through our restorative justice and also justice curriculum, we have built in a lot of like education and also awareness of our youth, why it is so important to build solidarity with other communities. And it's only through education and understanding and acceptance that we could really have a safe community for all. So there has been a lot of changes on the ground, even for our service level. Last month, we were actually also our youth leader partnering with the Stop API Hate Youth campaign youth leaders to host a panel with the California Department of Education. And they also have recommended when school restart, how can we best support our students during this time, including advocate for anonymous reporting systems with language needs, and also how to encourage to promote racial affinity groups on the school ground, how to provide professional development training for the teachers on anti-bullying, and also how to provide culturally competent mental health services to our youth at the school in the community.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah, and for the work you're doing. It's actually a perfect transition to the next part of our conversation. You know, we've heard about, from all the speakers, about some of the challenges, some of the obstacles, and kind of a detailed picture of the pain and fear and anxiety that's being experienced by so many different members of our Asian American Pacific Islander community. And Sarah, your comments really help us transition to thinking about problem solving, right? What do we do about it? You know, how do we move forward in a way that's safer and stronger and more inclusive? I think in the last few months, we've all seen the AAPI community demonstrate tremendous resilience by uniting, coordinating through community rallies and events and marches with speakers and powerful messages from folks bringing really diverse perspectives and ideas. There have been volunteer patrol groups to escort the elderly and bystander intervention trainings put together by the Asian Law Caucus and Hollaback. And there have been so many other outspoken advocates and creative ideas coming from community to support community. So I want to now turn this question first to you, PJ. Based on your experiences, what are some of the positive things that have come out of this movement? And how can we continue to move in the right direction as we look for concrete solutions?
I think from my experience, just doing this work, especially with the elders, you know, there's a new awareness, right? There's a new awareness about their vulnerability, about the environment, about what's happening. And I think like there's so much messages out there, and some messages not positive and some not even real, right? I think it's just fake news. We say that for lack of a better word. And I think like the elder that I work with, you know, like the training helps them, you know, how to keep themselves safe, right? And how to keep their family safe and how to move forward. But what I love most about what I'm hearing with this movement, with these marches, with the social medias, also like when community come together, is that we're creating messages of hope, right? Messages that as a community we can do better. You know, like we can break some of these barriers. We can come together as a community to support one another, and we can heal from some of the trauma. And I think like what I would love to see, you know, like I was talking about like escort, you're talking about like events and stuff like that. Like it's not just like an event that is going to be with the API community, but events that can encompass all culture. Like the people need to see that we're a community, right? One community. So seeing other people, other community, you know, whether they're Black community, whether they're white community, whether they're Hispanic community, coming together with us, working, because you know, in my work, in my field, I'm in meetings with everybody of all nationality, of all background, right? I think like there's a bunch of representation everywhere. And I think that's like the world that I live in. And I think like that's the world that for me, you know, it reminds us of solidarity. It reminds us that we're all the same, that we're doing the same work, that we're trying to make better our community. And I think like there's not enough message out there to show that we are one community, that we're all doing this work together, and we're all trying to help one another grow and stop this, you know, racism. Because I think, you know, like people of color, we all experience racism. You know, we all experience some kind of inequality. Like there's history shown of our struggle, and I think sometimes we forget that. So I think like I think the message is very important, how we message social media, and I think it should not be focused on separation and barriers, but focusing more on community solidarity.
Thanks for that, BJ. And, you know, speaking of social media and other media, I mean, there's a saying, information is power. And of course, the inverse is also true. Disinformation or misinformation can be very disempowering. So Annie, I want to ask you in particular to speak to some of these issues around misinformation or disinformation in the community, whether it be via social media or more traditional media platforms. And can you speak, Annie, to the role of media in this moment in helping to move us forward rather than backwards?
Yes, thank you, Chesa. I think that media, and whether it's ethnic, traditional, you know, mainstream or ethnic media, are all very important partners in this movement, as PJ calls it. We really need to activate our contact list, and especially with a lot of friends that actually are in the media. They're journalists, right? They write for magazines, some write for online articles. But our stories, the AAPI stories, usually never quite made it to mainstream media. And it's only when hate incidents and hate crimes and violence happens, then you have lots of opportunity to speak to the mainstream media. So I like us to work harder to get our positive stories, the accomplishments of our AAPI members, the elderly that have become victims. You know, they have accomplished a lot to come to the United States if they're foreign born, but even their past accomplishments are all wiped out. People only focus on the hurt, right, or on the weakness, and then they're drawing all these attention and of attacks and hate crimes. So I like us to kind of refocus a little bit, like listening to Jen's poem. You know, it just brings back. Sometimes we really have to, you know, even if it's painful to relive those incidents, it's really painful to see these videos, you know, that people are pushed from behind, stepped on, and then victims are kicked in the head multiple times. But we have to now refocus and bring some positive energy to hold our community, to make our community whole. I think that we could do it in a million ways. You know, like for example, I already talked about giving tender loving care to our elderly relatives and non-relatives, you know, just friends. I heard from our seniors that they miss walking in the parks. Now they don't dare to go out to walk alone. So when you have a off day, call your grandparents if they are here, or call an elderly neighbor, take them out to Golden Gate Park for a short walk, and then maybe to a dim sum lunch afterwards. You know, that would really make their day. Also get, just like PJ said and August said, be involved and be engaged. If the media call you, say yes, no matter how difficult it is, or you have to find time for these interviews. Go on radio, TV, talk to any journalist you know, to talk about again some very positive accomplishment. Like Sarah's is part of a coalition that is doing a lot of criminal justice, supporting the victims and educational work, and as well as community outreach. So we also ask all your friends in your network to volunteer for something. You know, we all have talents and we could all get engaged. Yeah, I'm putting together a volunteer senior escorts program so that I could take people on their off days, you know, to actually provide a personal escort after we provide them all the orientation and training. And last but not least, I'm part of the Human Rights Commission's Stand Together in Solidarity campaign. And recently in the rally, I brought back books of other culture, like the African American culture and the Native American culture, children's books. And I brought them back to, you know, my staff and some of my seniors and have them read to their grandchildren or children so that their children start to really learn from their own parents and grandparents and the community about other culture, so that we are really part of the entire community that we are live in. So I hope that we will find more media friends to work our stories into with them. It could be over food, right? Our Asian culture is famous for food culture. So maybe we could start there.
Thank you for that, Annie, and thank you for the work. And also, you mentioned some of the work that Sarah's doing. So I want to turn now to Sarah and follow up on your point there, Annie. You know, San Francisco has always been home to so many different groups, and you know, there's so much difficult work to do to ease racial tension between these groups and to ensure that everyone feels safe and heard and included in our city. I know that CYC has really rolled up its sleeves and started doing some of that challenging community building work in the Bayview through the Bayview Youth Advocate Program, a program that seeks to raise awareness and promote racial understanding and harmony through respect between and among Asian, African American, and Latino residents in the Bayview. This is something we can really never start too early. And I know that the young members of CYC in this group are playing a really important role fighting for positive change in their community, in their families, and in our city. Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about the program and what steps CYC has taken to address the current situation in terms of racial tension?
Sure, thank you for bringing up our Bayview Youth Advocates Program. This program is actually a multicultural leadership development program, like you mentioned, in the San Francisco's southeastern neighborhood. Its focus is really on advocacy, education, and civic engagement, especially across the communities of color. It was actually formed in 2011 when we started our Bayview branch office, because at that time, there's a huge need and demand for programs, resources, and service for the growing Asian population in the Bayview area. Which actually over 30% of the population in Bayview are actually Asian. So by bringing all these young people together, we really hope to using like youth leadership and then really to educating our young people so that they could also be ambassador to educate the community about the very rich local history of the Bayview. And also promote like civic engagement and have the young people supporting them to do local organizing and also collaborate across different community partners in the Bayview area. Some upcoming projects, including like a community-based mural that will be located in Bayview as a symbol of solidarity amongst the Black and Asian community. It will be complete in partnership with the Chinese Cultural Center and the African American Arts and Cultural District. That we hope that will help highlight the history and culture of the vibrant Bayview community so that young people can take pride of where they are. And I think with this pandemic, I think it's more important than any time that I've seen for collaboration. Our youth leadership programs have partnered with like Human Rights Commission, the Cross-Cultural Justice Group, with Beyond Differences in the Marin County, and also California Department of Education and Stop AAPI Youth Campaign leaders with one single goal and idea is how to raise awareness and stand against together anti-Asian hate. And we really want to have our young people to help them to lift up their voice, whether it's using social media platforms, whether it's a youth-led, committee-led forum, or like roundtable discussion, or even actually as a panel speaker like us, to really recommend what they think will build a better school ground society for all of us together. So we have been engaged in a lot of different type of events. Our young people last summer even actually developed a free Stand Up for API youth curriculum with Beyond Differences that for teachers, a target for middle school to high school that address about anti-bullying. So as of this point, we have over 900 schools sign up for that curriculum and free toolkits across the nation. However, ironically, there's still a lot of work we need to be done at the school district in San Francisco. For the 900 schools, none of them are actually in San Francisco. So we have to work very diligently and really advocate to really build in this anti-bullying curriculum into our school district locally. Our young people will really, that what we believe that we're able to create a change and how we can see a better community. So there's a lot more work to be done, and they are really busy this year, and I'm really proud how our young people really step up, no longer just being silent, but really also speak up about the need for API community.
I love that image that I have in my mind, Sarah, as I listen to you describe the work the young people are doing. And it's so great to have solutions grounded in community and grounded in youth and in our future. So thank you for the work and for sharing it with us. And I want to now zoom out and take a bird's eye view. And I want to turn to Assemblymember Kalra and talk about, in parallel to the community grounded work, also the state legislation that's going to impact everyone across the state. Assemblymember Kalra, you've placed a lot of emphasis in your legislative work on eliminating systemic discrimination and racism, which you view as one of the causes of these recent surge in hate incidents. Now, we talked earlier briefly about the Racial Justice Act, but you also authored the CLEAR Act, the California Law Enforcement Accountability Reform Act. And that act would require that there be a background check for law enforcement applicants, including critically finding out whether the candidate for law enforcement jobs is a member of a hate group or has participated in hate group activities. And if so, that would potentially disqualify them from having a law enforcement job. Can you talk about this act and how it would directly impact the kind of hate incidents that we're seeing today across California?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've been working on this for about a year and a half with the San Jose State University Human Rights Initiative and Professor Will Armeline, based upon the fact that, even last week, Attorney General Garland was speaking to the fact that you have these police officers, law enforcement that are part of these extremist groups. And this is something that's been known for 15 years now. The FBI and Department of Justice has made it very clear that there's been an intentional infusion into law enforcement by these groups. And so the idea behind it, and of course, January 6th, I think, made it very visceral when we learned how many law enforcement officers were part of the attack on the Capitol. But it's been an issue for a long time. So putting forward this legislation really allows us the opportunity to very directly have law enforcement agencies, as part of their backgrounding process, look into affiliations with extremist groups, white supremacist groups, violent extremist groups, and to disqualify those affiliated with these groups from law enforcement. It also allows for law enforcement to, if they're made aware of, to terminate a current law enforcement officer. We saw that happen in Fresno a few weeks back with an officer that was a member of the Proud Boys and was terminated for it. And so what we've actually had some really good work that we've done with law enforcement over the last few weeks as this bill has moved forward, because early concerns about some of the language on the legislation was a little too broad on kind of the net it was putting out there, but we've tailored the language in a way I think that really focuses on those groups that have proven to have shown violent and extremist tendencies. And where you've seen supremacist groups that have targeted law enforcement. And so not only is it encouraging that in recent weeks, we've had great conversations with PORAC and some of the larger law enforcement agencies like Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, that are now, essentially they're in support of the bill in its mission, but now we're actually getting to a point of working on the language where there's a great likelihood they'll come on and support, which, if you think about that 5-10 years ago, it was probably unheard of. And so I think that what we've seen happen in our nation over the last couple of years, with, both in terms of Black Lives Matter and the resurgence of the Black Liberation Movement, on top of what we saw at the Capitol and the hate that's been spewed, we're seeing responsible law enforcement agencies step forward and say, you know what, we don't want these kinds of people in our police departments. Now, we're not hearing it necessarily from some other jurisdictions in California, whether it's Central Valley, north, far up north in California. And that's why this legislation also allows for the Attorney General, if the local agency refuses to act, the Attorney General can take action once it's been made known that there are particular applicants that have these kinds of affiliations. And that's why having Attorney General Bonta create the Racial Justice Bureau is huge, both in terms of responding to hate crimes, as we've been discussing over the past hour, but also part of it is also going to be focused on rooting out extremists from law enforcement. And so I'm very excited to have that partnership with Attorney General Bonta, as well as some of the forward-thinking law enforcement agencies that are absolutely on board with the mission. And so it's huge in terms of creating trust with the community, creating trust within the AAPI community, and other communities, especially immigrant communities, where they can feel safe knowing that if they're calling for help from their local police department, that the person that's coming to help them doesn't other them, right, in the way that they respond to them, as we've been talking about, and doesn't make them feel less than, or make them feel like they're not being served in a way that is genuine. And most of all, we don't want these extremists and racists that are in law enforcement. I mean, I think that should be a baseline that we all can agree on. And so I'm very excited that the legislation is moving forward. And there was actually an article a couple of days ago in the New York Times, I'm gonna put it in the chat, that does refer to this bill, as well as other states that are working on this type of legislation. So with Attorney General Garland in DC, Attorney General Bonta here in Sacramento, I think we have an opportunity to do things that we just haven't done before. And this is one of those areas that I think we can make great progress on.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, there's just such a long history in this country of having deep ties between groups like the Ku Klux Klan in the Deep South and law enforcement. And we know how much damage that history and that present reality, as you described in the takeover of the Capitol, that damage that's done to the trust between the communities that law enforcement have sworn to serve and protect and communities that are impacted by crime and violence. We need vulnerable community members to trust law enforcement. And it's very hard to have that trust if we see images of law enforcement participating in white supremacist rallies or events. So thank you for your leadership on this. And as we kind of round out this panel, I want to just turn for one last question to Annie Chung. And Annie, just, we've heard from Sarah about some of the, really on the ground things that are happening. We've heard from PJ as well. Assemblymember Kalra, changing the law statewide, the kind of leadership we're seeing locally and at the state level. Annie, are there any other things in your view that we can do to support our Asian seniors here in San Francisco, in addition to holding those who cause harm accountable, making the kinds of changes, doing the kind of community work we've discussed? What else can we do here in San Francisco to support Asian seniors in particular?
Thank you, Chesa. I think that it's very important to also reach across the different departments, Board of Supervisors, DA's office, SFPD, Sheriff's Department. You all have a part to play in building that trust, right? Because our first generation seniors, particularly those who don't speak English or speak it fluently, are actually afraid to go into any law enforcement agencies, because from very young they're taught not to do anything to attract lawyers or police or attorneys, in your life, right? So there is a little bit of a separation that our elderly said that they would prefer not to enter into a police department if they don't have to. But the culture here is different, right? We have to report crimes. We have to make known what is necessary to keep our community safe. So it's kind of like an uphill battle to get more of the LEP, the limited English proficiency members of our community to trust in the law enforcement partners. So we have a lot of ways to create that trust. Utilize your community-based organization, particularly those that are already built up trust. Have them be your interface so that they could bring, whatever you need to. Let's say in another month, it's Elder Abuse Month. So let Casey and Kitty and Peter and you, Chester, talk up, right, the importance of prevention of elder abuse in the various AAPI languages, or even with non-Asian senior groups, because it's a really important, really matter and subject in our community. Individually, what can we do to support our seniors? There are lots of ways people want to engage. I could feel, a lot of love really coming to support our Asian seniors. One very specific suggestion that I could make is through the generous support of the Academy of Science, Ike Kwan, the COO, invited 150 of our seniors for a free afternoon in the academy. Our first field trip of 50 elderly just took place on Wednesday, and the seniors for a few hours in the afternoon felt totally safe in that environment, and they became like kids again. You're running to see the rainforest and the penguins and the lions. So Ike and I were escorting them from exhibit to exhibit. And if you are part of a museum board, or if you have a chance to invite a group of AAPI seniors to spend an afternoon or a morning, with you, do that. It doesn't take that much to bring happiness to our seniors, particularly around crisis time. So and thank you again, Chester, for inviting all of us. I want to kind of end by looking at, we are in a crisis right now, but the Chinese word for crisis is very interesting. It has danger, but also opportunity in the same word, right? You've may all have encountered this already. So meaning that we are in a crisis time, but there are lots of still opportunities and hope. So I'll end by saying, hope lives in all of us, and tomorrow will be a better day. In Chinese, it translates to 明天會更好，希望在人間. So I have hope that we will all work together and bring back some happiness and sense of safety, to our senior members whom we all love and honor and respect. But we cannot do it alone. Sarah and I and Orchid and PJ, we cannot do it alone. We need Assemblyman Cara. We need all our state and federal, local representatives, and we need you, Chester. And thank you very much for appointing Casey to head up the victims unit that speak our language. Now we could go to Kitty and Casey and Peter, and when Sarah supports the victims, we have somebody that we could actually bring to our victims to make them feel safe. That's the most important thing we all can do.
Thank you so much, Annie. And it's just a wonderful image that you describe of the seniors enjoying the exhibits. And those are the kinds of opportunities and the kind of space we all want to create for our elders. I really want to thank all of our panelists for not only your contributions today and making time for us, but even more importantly, for your leadership in the community and for the amazing work that you and your organizations and your teams are doing day in and day out to promote safety and understanding and trust in and amongst our most vulnerable. Speaking of teams, I also would be remiss if I didn't give a very, very big shout out and thank you to my team that helped bring this together. Annie, you were kind enough to mention many of the folks in my office who speak Cantonese. Casey Lee, our new Director of Victim Services, Kitty Fong, Peter Hun, of course, Jackson G, and also to help make today possible, a lot of other folks stepped up, including Robin Burke and Kelsey Russum. So I want to just acknowledge and appreciate the tremendous amount of work that went into bringing everyone together today to share these experiences, these visions, and as Annie says, the opportunity within the crisis that we're facing. So thank you all for the work. To our attendees, we're going to take a very brief 5-minute stretch break, and we'll be back at 11:20 sharp to start off our next panel. Thank you again for your work and for joining us today. See you in a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessa.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed a quick break, stretched your legs, got a glass of water. I want to jump back in and make sure we stay on schedule because we have a lot of exciting speakers and conversations ahead of us. I also want to just thank everyone who is staying with us for our second panel. And before we jump in, I will remind myself and our new panelists to please slow down just a little bit to ensure that our interpreters can keep up and include our monolingual Chinese speakers who are here today. We also now are going to move into a bit of a more technical discussion, so all the more reason to speak slowly and be inclusive. We're going to talk about hate crimes, including investigation and prosecution of hate crimes, along with some analysis of the efficacy of existing laws and opportunities for improvement in these areas of prosecution and investigation of hate crimes. So I want to start by introducing one of our panelists today. Anand Subramanian is the Managing Director of PolicyLink. He also served as the Executive Director of the San Francisco Blue Ribbon Panel on Transparency, Accountability, and Fairness in Law Enforcement. He's a member of the board of the South Asian Americans Leading Together. Additionally, on this panel, we have with us Michael German. He's a fellow with the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School. And he also served for 16 years as an FBI special agent. During that time, his assignments included infiltrating white supremacist groups as a deep cover agent. Another panel member with us today is Angela Chan, who is the policy director and a senior staff attorney at Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. Angela also served on the San Francisco Police Commission for 4 years and was an instructor for the RASA department at San Francisco State University, teaching courses on race, crime, and justice. And finally, we have with us on our panel today, Assistant District Attorney Xochitl Carrion, who's been with my office for the past 6 years, and most recently has been assigned to handle hate crime cases. She's been responsible for working with the specialized San Francisco Police Department hate crime inspectors and other police department inspectors and officers at the investigating, charging, and prosecution stage for hate crimes that come into our office. So, Xochitl, let me start with you and ask, about this surge in crimes against AAPI victims that we've seen. It's led many people to ask about what exactly is a hate crime and why aren't hate crimes charged more frequently? California does have hate crime statutes, including hate crime enhancements, which essentially increase the criminal penalties for people accused of committing racial violence or other racial-based crime. But some folks have said that the burden of proof, the higher standard, deters prosecutors from filing these charges. So, as I said earlier in your introduction, Eddie Carrion, you've been the office's dedicated hate crime prosecutor for years. Can you tell our audience a bit about what hate crimes are, what types of proof is required to support a hate crime charge, and how that's different from, say, an assault or a robbery that does not include that hate crime element?
Of course, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you and also to share with the community all the work that I've been doing day in and day out on behalf of the Asian community and the increase of hate crimes that we have here in San Francisco. So hate crimes are codified in the California Penal Code. It's Penal Code section 42.55. It specifically defines hate crimes as a criminal act committed in whole or in part because of one or more of the following actual perceived characteristics of a victim. So basically what that is protected classes are statutorily identified. Now, what are those protected classes? The first is disability, and that could be a combination or individual of physical or mental disability. The second is gender, and that deals with female, male, transgender, non-binary, two-spirited people. We also have the protected status of nationality, meaning the origin of country, where you came from. Your race, ethnicity, relevant here as an Asian American person, as an Asian person. You also have your religion, whether it's Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of those different protected religions. We also have a protected status for sexual orientation, which is separate from gender, dealing with our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, depending on sexual orientation, as well as queer identified individuals. And the final is more of a catch-all. It's called associated with any of the above. And I try to explain it as this really kind of comes when we talk about biracial couples. So for example, if you are Asian and your partner is Caucasian and you are walking together and both of you are being harassed because of your race or your gender, even if your partner is, for example, a Caucasian white man, if he were to be harassed because he's with you, he would be protected underneath the hate crime statutes. Now, it's important to keep in mind that hate crimes are a completely different and unique legal creature. They have a different standard than other crimes. They have a different intent requirement than other crimes. And that sometimes can be challenging for folks who have not specifically worked in hate crimes. So what are some of the examples of crimes? You can be hit, you can be assaulted, you're robbed, your house can be burglarized, property can be vandalized. If you're threatened to be killed or suffered with great bodily injury, and there's a reasonable belief that that can actually happen. In fact, any crime can constitute a hate crime. But how do we know that it's a hate crime? We have to prove that it's motivated, meaning because of your race or your protected status. That means that that protected status has to be a substantial factor in the criminal conduct. For example, if you are perceived or you are Asian, and that's the reason why someone is attacking you, that may constitute a hate crime. If it would have been a crime of opportunity and you just happen to be Asian and they're not targeting you specifically because you're Asian, then it may not fall within the hate crime statutes. Now, it's important to keep in mind that hate crimes and hate speech are very different. And there is a lot of confusion for that. And the reason why is because hate speech is actually constitutionally protected by the First Amendment. So the free speech clause of the First Amendment protects hate speech on the grounds that the government is strictly required to protect robust debate on issues of public concern, even if such debate is outrageous, hurtful, or hateful, and it results in fear, grief, or anger. And that's our US Supreme Court. I'll go ahead and in the chat, I'll go ahead and add that site for any of the law nerds that want to read that article. Now, there are specific challenges legally and emotionally to proving hate crimes because there's expectations of what we think we can prove and what we actually can prove. In addition, there's a wide range of hate crimes. They're unique to hate crimes is this motivation factor. And that's what prosecutors need to prove. That this act of hostility, that this criminal act is motivated by prejudice. Now, bias motivation is defined by Penal Code Section 422.87. It is a pre-existing negative attitude, including but not limited to hatred, animosity, resentment, revulsion, contempt, fear, paranoia, callousness, thrill-seeking, social dominance, social bonding with one's kind, and perceived vulnerability of the victim. Now, as a prosecutor dealing with hate crimes, how do I go about proving motive? First, I look at the victims and the witness impressions. What is their perception? What is it that makes someone believe that this is a hate crime. The most telling part is the actual use of words, whether they're written or verbal, and gestures. There's statements by the suspect before, during, after the crime. There's also signs and symbols. Individuals sometimes have tattoos of swastikas or different kinds of images. There can be clothing, patches, adornment, bumper stickers. The differences between the suspect and the victim. Looking at the surrounding circumstances. It's important to keep in mind the context, the date, the time, location. Are these crimes happening in specifically Asian communities? Are there a particularized selection and focus? Is there a complete absence of other motivation for the crime? One of the sources that we look at, and I look at personally, are the recordings of incidents. And we've talked about that throughout today, is the importance of surveillance and phone recordings, but also of 911 and also body-worn camera, which here in San Francisco, officers are required to wear. We look at all of the evidence at looking at what is biased and prejudiced. So there's different ways of finding these information. The different sources include the documented incidents, past police reports, patterns of conduct, social media. Are people posting pro-hatred materials? Internet searches. What are someone's browser history? What is it that they're interested in? Association and affiliations. We look at journals, diaries, notebooks, the books that they're reading, the signs, the symbols, prior victimization. Also, we look at who the friends and the families are, neighbors, where are they living, who's the coworkers? And importantly, if there's complaints. We look at whether there's lawsuits and different protective orders that are already in place protecting individuals. Now, some of the hurdles in hate crimes are fearful and reluctant victims and witnesses. And I'll probably talk about that a little bit more, as well as mistaken identification. We want to make sure that people have an opportunity, especially when folks have these moments. They're incredibly challenging. It is incredibly hard to keep in mind of what's happening when you are the subject of this vitriolic hate. There's also arguments of self-defense or defense of property that may be raised. And one of the largest battles that we have is the insufficient evidence of bias. For example, a suspect can say, well, I have friends who are Asian. I work with Asians. There's no way that I would have done this. But in fact, we all know that it's a lot more complicated than that.
Thank you so much for that, ADA Carrion, and of course for all of your work on behalf of these issues and these survivors. I want to turn now to Michael German and sort of move upstream from where prosecutors get involved and look at the earlier stages in law enforcement. You know, Michael, you've been outspoken about the challenges faced by local law enforcement in proving hate crimes cases, the work that ADA Carrion has been doing and just described. I also want to shift a little bit broader and look at the federal level. The Department of Justice also has really low charging rates, even despite expanding hate crime protections through statutory changes over the past decade. You know, the number of referrals to federal prosecutors under all of the existing 5 federal statutes on this issue was really low. And there was a study a few years ago by Syracuse University's Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, or TRAC, that found that of about 2,000 hate crime investigations that were referred in a 10-year period from 2009 to 2019, only about 15% resulted in prosecutions. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges, both from an investigative standpoint and once an investigation is referred in following through with prosecution?
Thanks very much, District Attorney Boudin, for including me and for hosting this important discussion. And you're right, the Justice Department, the US Justice Department and the FBI are often better positioned to investigate and prosecute hate crimes than local authorities. Number one, they have much older statutes. The first federal statutes criminalizing racist violence were passed in 1871, the Enforcement Act. enforcement acts, which included the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 and the Civil Rights Act. So these were laws that were extremely effective in dismantling the first era of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. Unfortunately, they fell into disuse as Reconstruction ended and were out of use for about 50 years before they were resurrected again during the Civil Rights era of the 1960s. So these laws have been through the court system, the federal court system, that prosecutors know how to use them. They still are the foundation to 5 federal hate crime statutes. So there's plenty of authority that Congress has provided to the federal government. There's also an advantage in uniformity, right? As we discussed, California has a strong hate crime statute that covers a lot of different protected categories, but many states don't. 5 states don't have hate crime laws. Many states protect some communities, but not other communities. So somebody traveling across the country might find themselves protected against bias violence in one state, but when they cross the state line, they find they're not protected. So there's a lot of benefit to having a robust federal system to address these problems. Unfortunately, the Justice Department has policies and practices that deprioritize the investigation of hate crimes. Number one is the FBI's prioritizations. Certain types of violence that it categorizes as terrorism are the top priority, and those tend to be types of violence that attack powerful institutions like the US Congress. And of course, we've seen a robust federal reaction to the assault on the Capitol. But the same white supremacist and far-right militant groups that attacked the Capitol have been attacking populations across the country without that same kind of federal offense, because the FBI categorizes that kind of crime as a hate crime, and that drops down to the 5th priority. So that deprioritization of what are equal amounts of violence leads to a position where these crimes aren't getting the kinds of resources that they need. And finally, the Justice Department has a policy of deferring hate crime investigations and prosecutions to local authorities, where in a case like San Francisco, where a police department has dedicated resources for hate crimes, where the district attorney's office has dedicated prosecutors, that might make some sense because the local authorities can respond much quicker. They have much better understanding of the communities that they're serving. The problem is that's not always the case. And in many cases, the reason that survivors of hate crimes don't report to police is because there's already a fraught relationship. So the policy, the Justice Department policy of deferring to state and locals is deferring it into a black hole, and those crimes don't receive the type of investigation that they deserve. And the numbers tell a story. You know, the numbers from the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse you mentioned are where the FBI actually did an investigation, and then they run into the same difficulties with the prosecution and finding the correct evidence to apply the law that ADA Carrion mentioned for the local authorities. They're dealing with the same evidence, so the same sort of difficulties arise. But looking broader, the Justice Department does crime victim surveys. And according to those surveys, they estimate 230,000 hate crimes occur across the country each year. Yet the Justice Department only prosecutes about 25 hate crime defendants each year. So there is a huge number of these crimes that are not being addressed either by local police or by the federal government. And the federal government can do a much better job either resourcing the state and locals who are doing the work or doing the work themselves with the authorities they have.
Thanks for that, Michael. Wow, that gap is really massive, and it's an important reminder of the need to work at the state and local level to try and fill that gap. I want to turn now to Anand. You know, you chaired the Blue Ribbon Panel on Accountability and Fairness in Law Enforcement here in San Francisco. And, you know, that panel made very specific findings with regard to local law enforcement culture as it relates to race, gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation bias. Can you tell us a bit about that panel, its findings, and how they relate to law enforcement's role in assessing and investigating, and if appropriate, effectively prosecuting whether a particular incident is driven by hate?
Thank you so much, DA, both for having me and for highlighting these issues. I think they're so important, and this level of conversation about them and really thinking critically about solutions, I think, is really what's needed. So I really appreciate this space. I acted as the executive director of the Blue Ribbon Panel on Transparency, Accountability, and Fairness in Law Enforcement. It was an investigation of the San Francisco Police Department for institutionalized bias that took place from 2015 to 2016. The panel itself was 3 esteemed judges, and the investigation was supported by 8 renowned international law firms and attorneys from those law firms really doing deep dive investigations, interviews, et cetera. At the end of our investigation, we issued a report with 72 findings and 81 recommendations. We did find that there was institutionalized bias within the department in many ways. And what we mean when we say institutionalized bias is, are the policies, the practices, the culture of the department lending themselves to entrenching and sustaining bias that is felt by these protected classes that the ADA mentioned earlier. And we did find that in many ways, the department in San Francisco was. I will say that we issued, as I mentioned, 81 recommendations. Most of those recommendations were incorporated into a United States Department of Justice report that was a collaborative review of the Civil Rights Division of the US DOJ and the San Francisco Police Department that started about 3 months after our investigation in the wake of the police killing of Mario Woods in San Francisco. That report had 272 recommendations. That was issued about 3 months after our report was issued in October of 2016. And the progress in implementing those recommendations, including the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Panel, has been incredibly slow. I think earlier this year, the department had reported implementing about 69 of the 272 recommendations 5 years later, which is a really dismal track record. I think it's not surprising that our investigation found evidence of bias in the department. I think that was clear going in, that the San Francisco Police Department was biased. In fact, our investigation was sparked by a discovery that 14 officers had engaged in racist and homophobic text messages with each other. And that would not have been discovered if not for a federal investigation. This panel was an advisory body to the DA's office at the time, DA Gascon. And in my work since around the country, I think, it's very clear to folks around the country that policing is in many ways inherently biased. And I think that's sort of the jump that we need to make. So when we think about institutionalized bias, we talk about the infiltration of white nationalism or white supremacist groups. We talked on the earlier panel, and Mr. German talked about it as well. But it's not just that white nationalists have infiltrated law enforcement, which is all true. Recent FBI reports have suggested as much. It is really that policing itself is designed to entrench the status quo. That's what it's there to do. When we think about order, it's the status quo. And our status quo is deeply racialized. Our status quo has deep racial divisions. And we've learned so much about the through line of slavery, from slavery to now, and how our criminal legal system was really developed to entrench some of those divisions. The new Jim Crow talks about this. The documentary, The 13th, talks about this. And so I think the last thing I'll say is related to the Blue Ribbon Panel. One of the most important aspects of the panel was our interviews with community members, with community leaders, with directly impacted folks. And I will post a link to the report in the chat. But across the board, the folks that we spoke to, folks who spoke languages other than English, folks who were survivors of intimate partner violence, people who were undocumented reported that they did not feel, well, they felt like when they did call the police for help, that they were actually questioned, that they were the ones who were treated as someone who had done something wrong. And so all of this suggests to me that the idea that we can trust police officers to adequately investigate whether an action was motivated by bias, I think is a really challenging concept. I think we've seen that bias is a deep part of policing across the country. And so the idea that an officer can assess whether an incident was motivated by bias, I think is a really questionable one. And on the front end, if an officer isn't really able to do that or is the wrong person to investigate that, I think that just is the first domino in the challenges that were described earlier about actually prosecuting hate crimes.
Thanks for that context and that background on the work you've done and San Francisco's done to try and improve law enforcement response. I want to just, emphasize that for our team in the district attorney's office, we rely really heavily on the investigation done by the police department. And so when we're looking at a case, whether it's to consider hate crimes or any other charge, we have to rely in the first instance on the investigation done by officers. We have to trust that they've asked the right questions, gathered available evidence. And if they haven't, it can dramatically shape the outcome of the case. And so that's why we work really closely to try and improve through similar work to what you described on the Blue Ribbon panel, ongoing collaborative trainings, to try and improve awareness and investigative techniques to identify the kinds of evidence needed to move forward in these cases. I want to turn now to Angela. And Angela, I want to ask you a question, but I want to lead with a quote from the writer Viet Thanh Nguyen, who said, quote, "Horrendous crimes against Asian Americans have happened recently, but we can be against anti-Asian violence and not resort to knee-jerk calls for more policing, which is inextricably from the policing of Black and Brown communities," end quote. Now, at the same time, as we see many of the AAPI victims who've been victimized are also from marginalized communities with little resources, and they're in fact desperate for more protection. So how can we reconcile the tension or the apparent tension between calls for more resources to be directed to policing and the need to actually invest resources in communities that can help build capacity, independence, integration, and strength and resilience?
Thank you, Chesa. First, thanks for holding this summit. And thanks to your team, especially Casey Lee, for all the hard work in organizing this important and urgent conversation. And I watched the previous panel, it was excellent. So for those who stayed on to watch the lawyers talk, you're very committed. So at my organization is the Asian Law Caucus. We're based in San Francisco, oldest nonprofit serving low-income API immigrants. And we have a long history of protecting and advancing the rights of API immigrants through legal services, litigation, local, state, and federal policy work. And we believe that the solution to interpersonal violence, right, the violence committed by individuals against other individuals, is not more systemic state violence in the form of aggressive or discriminatory law enforcement that inevitably harms communities of color, especially Black community members who receive the brunt of our criminal justice system. Instead, we should focus on community-based solutions. And I'll talk more about that later. So many AAPI victims of violence are from vulnerable segments of our community, including people who are elderly, people who are youth, women, LGBT, and low income, and immigrants. And according to Stop AAPI Hate data, 65% of victims are women, 11% are youth, and 7% are elders. It's no coincidence that the same community members who are likely to receive the brunt of individual interpersonal violence, right? Violence, attacks on the street, also receive the brunt of systemic violence. This includes unequal access to housing, education, employment, healthcare, transportation, and what we work a lot on, the Asian Law Caucus, immigration status. In fact, the lack of access to what should be these basic human rights places these community members in a place where they're more likely to be vulnerable to experience interpersonal violence. We heard from the previous panel that a lot of these incidences happened at bus stops, on the street, in public transportation, where people are more likely to be vulnerable to violence. And as someone who spent 15 years assisting community members, both who are victims of violence and those who've caused harm, I know what we don't need is this reflexive approach of funneling more resources, more power to police in our carceral system. This is not the first time there's been a spike in violence against API communities. We've experienced this time and time again. And in the past, I would say a lot of API organizations were reflexive and did say, okay, let's just put more money in law enforcement, more reliance on law enforcement. That hasn't gotten us anywhere. That hasn't enriched our communities with more services, more support. And what we found is that more funding for police means more harm and state violence inflicted on Black, Brown, and API community members. And I just want to name some of the people who've been killed by SFPD as someone who served in the police commission and pays close attention to this. Vin Bui, Randall Dunklin, Parleeth Prolong, Mario Woods, Jessica Nelson Williams, Luis Gongoria Pat, and Alex Nieto. These are some of the individuals who've been killed by SFPD, by police. And so it's important for us not to rely on police as the only solution to address violence against our communities. Temporarily and repeatedly locking up people who cause harm without addressing the root causes of violence at both the interpersonal and systemic level will further just drain public resources that can be better spent investing in more effective community-based solutions and interventions. And so some of the solutions that we recommend, and I'll put a policy guide in the chat box: mental health care, investing in mental health care for our communities that's language accessible and that's culturally competent. Affordable housing, right? In many of these situations, the individuals involved in the incidences, whether it be the victim or the offender, are people who are homeless, right? Who are houseless. Drug and alcohol treatment programs, because that's often a factor in some of these incidences, not that it excuses it, but it's a cause that we need to address. Restorative justice programs, because they've been found to be more effective at reducing recidivism when appropriate. Annie had talked about in the previous panel, Annie Chung, about accompaniment to elders, right? That's really important, having a community member that people trust to take them from their bus stop to their home, right? But very basic, but caring, loving, right? Something that we need to provide to our elders who all of our communities cherish. We also talked, I think there's a bit of a mention about bystanders, right? About someone being harmed on a bus and people not doing anything around them, right? The police often come afterwards, right? It's hard for them to arrive exactly when something happens. Where people who are around are the first responders, and for people to receive these bystander trainings so they know how to support the victim. And Chesa, thank you for the shout out to our work with Holler Back to provide these trainings. We provided numerous trainings open and free to the public, and people can check in our website for future trainings. And then ethnic studies, I don't know if that's been talked about yet, but we need to educate people, starting from our young people, right? About the history of violence against API communities, Black communities, Native American communities, and Latinx communities, right? And women, gender-based violence. And finally, just to kind of close on these points, that we need to improve conditions for low-wage workers, especially women of color, right? When we were asking about what people wanted, what they wanted is access to COVID vaccines, economic relief, childcare, healthcare, right? They need these things. They do not need to be criminalized, right? Things like sex work does not need to be criminalized. Instead, we need to protect the people who are in these low-wage, vulnerable positions. Thank you for
Thanks for that, Angela. And actually, your final point about protecting workers is so critical. It's one of the things I'm really proud we've done since I took office, is we launched an economic crimes against workers team, specifically to look at civil enforcement mechanisms to protect vulnerable workers. It's never been more important than in the last year, when frontline workers are not just dealing with challenges around living wage and work conditions that we know workers in the workplace have faced for centuries, but also dealing with the really unique challenges of COVID-19 and having access to PPE, dealing with childcare issues at home. So that's an area where our office is doing cutting edge work and filed a couple of lawsuits that stand to benefit tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people across the state of California. Obviously, we need to do more, and we're going to keep fighting in that space, as well as on hate crimes. Speaking of our office, I want to turn back to ADA Carrion and ask about the intersection between hate crime legislation and the practice that you do in a courtroom and the symbolism, and just ask you to expand a little bit on the perhaps symbolic nature of the decision to file hate crimes charges separate and apart from the underlying substantive punishment. Is there, what I've seen and what I've heard from a lot of conversations with the community is that some people want our office to file hate crimes charges, even in cases where the defendant or the person accused is already facing a possibility of life in prison. And so it seems like it means something more than just the punishment that it can bring with the case. That there's a symbolic or representative value to many people in denouncing the conduct as more than your average or typical murder, attempted murder, assault, whatever the underlying crime is. So, ADA Carrion, what are ways in which we can improve how we currently investigate hate crimes and give voice to the feelings of fear and outrage in the community that are still consistent with the evidence and the law?
I'm going to go ahead and take a two-part approach to responding to that. First, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the symbolic function of hate crimes. The California courts have recognized that hate crimes are, quote, more serious than conventional crimes.
ADA Carrion, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just learned that we have some technical difficulties with the interpreters. I want to make sure everybody hears your answer. So if you could give us one moment, and then we'll pick right back up with you.
It's a new tech world.
It is, and we're so lucky to have interpreters working hard. I know it's an exhausting job, so I want to again thank them for doing it, and to have to deal with the technical difficulties on top of folks like me who speak really quickly is more than anyone should have to bear on a Friday morning.
Of that.
So just give us 1 minute, and I think we're just trying to sort out the technical issues to make sure everyone can hear. All right, we're good to go. So ADA Carrion, pick up where you left off, and apologies again for the interruption.
No worries. Now, the California courts have recognized that hate crimes are, quote, more serious than conventional crimes. The injuries inflicted have more debilitating effect on the victim and on the members in the victim's community than do conventional crimes. And the injuries are also more severe. They're due because the crimes are more likely to be committed by strangers and multiple offenders. And I'll go ahead and put that site in the chat. Now, what does that translate to? Hate crimes destabilize communities. And they do so in a way that's different from other crimes. The intent of the legislation has been to enhance punishment if a person's criminal conduct was motivated by a particular class, because the punishment should better reflect what that big impact is of the crime. And here, it's not just that it happened to one person. When one hate crime happens to an individual, it happens to all members. It is an attack that is designed to send a message to the entire group, and that punishment should reflect that intent. In fact, people live in fear, and we've experienced that. We've heard that today, many stories of people living in fear because it could happen to you at any time. It doesn't matter your education. It doesn't matter how much you make. Someone looks at you and says, because you are Asian, I am going to attack you. Now, some folks don't know that the first federal hate crime law was signed in law in 1968. It was further expanded by President Obama in 2009, which enhances the toolkit for us prosecutors to be able to do this work. Folks also might not know that California is the first state to have hate crimes law. It was enacted in 1978. And specifically, it was enacted due to crimes committed against Asian folks. It was a culmination of the Asian Pacific Islanders civil rights movement to fight for ethnic studies, an end to the Vietnam War, reparations for Japanese Americans, more than 110,000 who were forced to into internment camps during the World War II. In fact, in 1976, President Gerald Ford signed Proclamation 4417, in which internment was declared a national mistake. Now, for the second part of that question is, what are ways that we can improve the way that we currently investigate hate crimes here in San Francisco? Let me explain to you a little bit of what that process is now. First, the SFGA receives hate crimes by 3 different ways. The more traditional is directly by investigations done by the police department. And then our own investigations. At times, while we receive a case, we receive more facts and have our own investigators take additional steps to be able to acquire evidence and information. In addition, we also have a community hotline for hate crimes that is in Cantonese.
Do we lose ADA Carrion? I think we lost you there.
I think, can you hear me now?
You're back.
Okay, wonderful.
We lost you when you were talking about the various language capacities of our hate crimes
crime
hotline.
hotline.
Yeah.
Now, that hotline is available in Cantonese, Mandarin, Arabic, and Spanish. Some of the things that we've done here in the office has been substantial trainings. There's been a total of 13 hate crime trainings, 6 of them that were specific to the Asian population, one of which was given directly to the San Francisco Police Department. I've also provided comments to the San Francisco Police Department's professional standards team, which is currently a working group developing a strategic bias plan. Now, we are also working on future trainings, but it's important to keep in mind that we're not working alone. We work in partnership with our law enforcement locally, but we also work with other prosecutors. We're part of a Bay Area hate crime working group, which includes Alameda County, San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, Marin County, and Contra Costa County, as well as a representative of the U.S. Department of Justice. One of the things that we constantly work on is acknowledging the past. What have been the past failures of law and law enforcement? When we want to improve investigations, it's important to keep in mind that there are mandating reporting of all of these agencies and working together at an interagency level to process for data collection and for reporting. One of the things that we can work on are looking at interagency agreements, also called memorandum of understandings, that detail the responsibilities and the roles of each agency so that we know how each of us operates, and that is transparent to community. In addition to the trainings that we do for officers, we have also been in the process of developing a checklist for first responding officers, which provides feedback and provides issues for them to be able, while on scene, to gather the necessary elements of the elements that we need to be able to prove the case. But in addition, it provides information as to what steps they can take to ensure that victims understand what the process is and what the next steps are. The training also includes looking at dispatch. How are we coding hate crimes? How are we informing police officers that they're going to go on scene and a hate crime is at issue? The important part of all of these is that we have a constant communication between all of our interagencies and a process by which to loop back. What is working? What is not working? How can we improve that? And issuing together joint statements of solidarity as well as educational materials, such as, for example, we've recently done a public service announcement that is going to be translated in different languages, as well as brochures about hate crimes for communities.
Thanks for all that work, ADA Carrion. And I know all those trainings that you led happened in a pretty short period of time. You mentioned 13 trainings. I think that's been in about a 12-month period. So I know it's been a huge amount of work for you and for the team at our office, and I just want to acknowledge the critical role that played even before we entered this national reckoning around hate crimes. You were doing the work, so thank you. I want to turn to Michael. Michael, you issued a report called Hidden in Plain Sight: Racism, White Supremacy, and Far-Right Militancy in Law Enforcement. And I kind of have a two-part question. One is, in that report, you describe how the challenge we face with racism in law enforcement is not simply implicit bias, but rather also explicit, organized racism. So I want to ask you about that difference. A lot of us do trainings in our office. We do lots of trainings on implicit bias, but is there more work to do around rooting out institutionalized explicit racism that's perhaps embedded in the structure as well as the culture of government and law enforcement? And also, as sort of a second part of the question, looking specifically at the Atlanta massacre, 2 months after that massacre, a prosecutor recently announced the decision to seek hate crime charges. And I'm wondering if you think what we're seeing now is kind of a response to this national outcry and the Stop AAPI hate movement that's leading to these decisions like the one in Atlanta, or if there's something that's changed in investigations and law, or if it's the political moment we find ourselves in that is leading to hate crimes charges being filed.
Thanks for the question. On the issue of explicit racism in law enforcement, this was discussed in the earlier panel as well. This is something that has long been known and recognized within law enforcement, but unfortunately the response has been to address the implicit and structural bias, the unconscious forms of bias. And I quoted 3 different police instructors in that report who do implicit bias training, and they all said they intentionally do not raise the issue of explicit bias because they're afraid it will alienate the audience, where it seems to me that when the police department itself recognizes this is a persistent problem, having an implicit bias training that doesn't recognize that somebody in that room, everybody knows, has engaged in it explicitly racist behavior would undermine the value of that training material. So, what we saw in many of the cases where people with affiliations with white supremacist or far-right militant groups and other racist behavior was that the police department knew about the problem long before the public found out. But the police department had determined they didn't have enough authority to fire the person. And yet, once the public outrage came about, they did fire the person. So clearly they had the authority, they just didn't want to exercise it. And so I think we need to put that at the front of the challenge here and say that we have to address explicit racism before we can get to the harder problems of implicit and structural racism. And on your second question, I think you're exactly right that it was organizing within the Asian American community and the broader civil rights community. You might remember after the horrific mass slayings in Georgia targeting Asian American spas, a police investigator came out quickly within 24 hours and said anti-Asian bias was not a motive, which number one was bad for any investigator to do that early in an investigation. Obviously, there's a lot of material that needs to be looked at and carefully examined before something like that could be determined. And I think there was a reaction to that. And I think this case is a good one to look at to understand some of the debilities, because the Georgia hate crime statute, number one, was a new statute. It had been passed after a previous statute had been found unconstitutional, but it is a sentencing enhancement. And in Georgia, premeditated mass murder already comes with significant penalties that are hard to enhance. So, it's understandable why a reasonable prosecutor might want to say, let's prosecute the premeditated murders and get the most grievous sentence that can be applied without adding this additional burden of proving the motive. I believe that the prosecutor obviously found evidence that justified those charges, and I'm not questioning that, but it's an issue where the impact of you talk about the symbolic value of laying a hate crime charge, and I've talked about it in terms of expressiveness, that these hate crime statutes are passed by our elected representatives because we recognize these crimes are more damaging to society and we want to express our outrage. So when the police do something that tends to discount that undermines the expressive purpose and creates a new injury. So it's very important that officials take every opportunity to express their outrage about these crimes and let the prosecutors, the assistant DAs working the cases work on the evidence, but make sure we're making clear to the community that was victimized that we understand that injury and we understand that pain, and that we're going to make sure that the intent of the hate crime to alienate your community is not successful, and that in fact we're going to do all we can to make sure that you are protected and included, and use it as an opportunity to build social cohesion that the crime is attempting to disrupt. And that's why programs like this are extremely important. So I commend you for doing it to make sure that social cohesion is reestablished and made firm.
Thank you, Michael. And that was actually really well said. And it's something that I have grappled with a lot over the last year, as there's been tremendous political pressure, as I said, even in cases where the person accused is already facing the possibility of life without parole, to add these hate crimes allegations. And I think you're right. It's the expressive value more than any actual legal function, because it does make our burden higher, our work more difficult. But the community wants to be heard and recognized. And so I think you said that really well. I want to turn for a different perspective on this to Angela. In our first panel today, Angela, we heard a lot about vicarious trauma that's been experienced by the entire AAPI community after an incident, whether it's a hate incident or an incident that is widely perceived and understood to be a hate incident. Angela, you've voiced some skepticism about the value of using hate crimes laws to recognize or validate the harm done to community. Can you explain where that skepticism comes from and what other ways you think community and/or law enforcement should use to address that expressive need that Mike talked about in his comment?
Thank you for that question. So there's certainly immense trauma to API communities when there's an incident of violence against our community members. I have family who are, scared to go outside, scared to go to the store because of what's happening, and that's immensely harmful and scary, right? And I appreciate that the panelists previously said some of the ways you can help is just by calling your relatives and letting them know you'll take them to the doctors, So certainly trauma runs deep in our communities and other communities of color because of these incidences. However, the problem with hate crimes law and legislation is they offer a false promise. They take the symbolic aspect of recognizing harm and they channel it into a punitive response focused on a single individual. It results in, in some cases, not many, longer jail or prison sentences, and that does nothing to stop further violence against our communities, right? Instead, it shores up this belief or this, the power of the carceral system, which in turn disproportionately targets vulnerable members of our communities for violence and criminalization. And it's just this vicious cycle that we have to stop, right? We don't confront individual or interpersonal violence with more systemic violence, which then causes more trauma, more harm, right? Not just to the individuals involved, but also their family members. So another way of looking at this is that the state can still recognize that there's bias and racism towards our community. The state can still do that, but they can do that rather than through dangling the potential of a hate crimes prosecution, which is rare, not just in San Francisco, but throughout the entire country, as you've all talked about, right? Instead, what the state can do is to recognize the history of individual violence, and I'm going to list, I want to make sure I list the long history of API violence, right? This is just a snapshot of it. But the Change Act that excluded women back in the 1870s, Chinese women, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, the Korean and Vietnam Wars, right, that have still to this day, torn apart refugee communities, the colonization of Hawaii, the targeting of Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian people following 9/11, the Muslim ban under the Trump administration, and the many other atrocities that occurred, and then currently the deportation of Southeast Asian API refugees, right? These are all incidences of hate, dramatic, systemic, harmful, intergenerational, Ken, I'll slow down, intergenerational hate violence that harms our communities that we would like to get recognized by the state, right? And the state solutions that the state can offer is investments of resources in our communities to assist all the people who've been impacted by this long history of systemic violence. And given that systemic racism is embedded in law enforcement agencies, as our panelists have talked about, we can't rely on these agencies to validate the harm caused to our communities, right? I often ask, why give them this power, right? We know the harm that's been caused. We know what the solutions are. We don't need to wait around for someone to put some kind of a gold seal on our experiences. We should demand the solutions now, right? We can't wait for the police, or even, with all due respect, the DA's office to decide when our community has been harmed, right? We already know that our communities are deserving of deep investments in resources in our communities. We know that we're deserving of equal access to housing, employment, healthcare, right? We don't need an incident to be, verified as a hate incident in order to receive those resources. And then a couple technical legal points, since we are a bunch of lawyers. It's, as you have all mentioned, it's hard to meet the burden of proof, right? That an individual in their heart and their mind is motivated by hate when they committed an act of violence. So when the community is waiting for an announcement that an incident was motivated by hate, many times we're disappointed, right? Because it's hard to prove it. And this is one more point to underscore, that the vast majority of incidences of hate are verbal harassment, and as AAPI Hate has found through their website, shunning, right, of API community members. And so in the vast majority of these incidents, over 85% or so, they can't be prosecuted as crimes. They're protected by the First Amendment, right? And so in these situations, we can't rely on these incidents as being designated as a hate crime. Instead, we need to just tackle them head on and demand resources and systemic change.
Thanks for that, Angela. My last question is really for everybody, but I want to start with Anna because, I want to get you back in the conversation here. And, the key issue for all of us, I think, is we want to be safer, and we want everyone in our communities to feel safer. And one of the challenges, and I'm kind of dovetailing with your comments here, Angela, one of the challenges is that by the time one of my assistant district attorneys gets involved, by the time the police get called, usually a crime has already occurred. Someone's already been harmed. Damage has already been done. And so we're all better off, it seems, if we can prevent and protect rather than simply respond and punish. And one of the challenges is just how do we do that? What effective measures can we as a society, we as community, we as government or law enforcement take to respond to and stem this surge in anti-Asian hate? What are concrete steps that we can take starting today? And let me start with you, Anna.
Sure. So I think Angela really named some important characteristics. I have a 7-year-old. If my 7-year-old were at a school where a racially motivated shooting took place, I would feel outrage and rage, and I would want that person who committed that harm to suffer. But I also want to double down on this idea of investing more in prevention and healing than punishment, even though it's really hard to think about it when you yourself are targeted or have actually experienced harm. I think the reason why we have hate crime policies are important. It's important that we prioritize protecting historically marginalized communities. It's important that as a society, we name that racially motivated hate or hate against other protected classes is wrong and will not be tolerated. But Angela's exactly right. I think doubling down on punitive approaches is not the right path. We've seen that in many other contexts where investment in policing and prisons is partly why we are in this space of mass incarceration, of budgets that need to rely on things like fines and fees, which target the same communities to increase revenue to pay for the policing in prisons. And so I think we need to think exactly as you said, DA, about prevention and healing. How do we ensure that the root causes of hate are addressed? How do we ensure that we provide basic needs and economic security so that the need to scapegoat communities is mitigated? How do we invest in a robust mental health support system instead of policing in prisons? Many of these incidents we know that many incidents in general, incidents of harm, are caused because people don't have the mental health support that they need and act out of crisis. And so these are the things that I think we need to invest in more. The uprisings last year really said the same thing. And this is why there was a global uprising that resonated with so many people. We need to have a paradigm shift in how we approach our criminal legal system writ large, and investing more in alternative solutions and testing them and giving them the space to pivot and grow will really will allow us to actually have answers to, well, if not hate crime legislation, then what? And so I think that's the first step.
Thanks for that. And others want to weigh in. I'm going to do something that I know a moderator of a Zoom panel does at their peril and just open it up to other panelists who have things to add here. I see ADA Carrillo, and you unmuted yourself. That's a good sign. Go for it.
Okay, great. As someone that is working on prosecuting these crimes, I think I already spoke a little bit about the importance of having government partnerships and community partnerships. But it's really important for community to understand the process and for us to be able to communicate clearly with each other, because as has been indicated by many of the panelists as well as the DA, is that prosecutors have a very important ethical duty to look at the facts and apply the law. We are not to charge based on politics. We are not to charge based on beliefs or speculation. We are to critically analyze what are the facts and how is it that the evidence that is available helps us meet the elements of the particular crime. Now, as someone, again, that I'm constantly looking at what is the evidence, it is essential that community and allies report. I cannot stress it as much. And it's important to call as soon as possible. You can call 911 or you can call our hotline. And it's important. One of the things that I look at is detailing what happened, the who, the when, the where, what was the language that was used? What was the specific language? What is that person? Who is that person? What makes you believe that a hate crime occurred? Evidence such as photos and videos, writing, incredibly powerful. It's important now that we have, the age of dirty deletes, take screenshots of any text or social media that you believe may be helpful. Provide best contact information or an alternative contact. We also have emergency protective orders that individuals can get at the scene in order to feel safer and make sure that those people are protected in the future. Now, Angela already provided this information on the chat, but Hollerback has the 5 Ds of the bystander intervention, which is number 1, to distract, to take an indirect approach to de-escalate the situation, such as calling that person's attention away, like asking, do you know the time? Do you know this? And kind of stopping it when it happens. It's also important to make sure that you're safe when these incidents occur. You can delegate. You can ask someone else for help and ask someone to call 911. You can delay. After the incident is over, check in with the person who is harassed. I always ask people, please don't leave. If the police comes, that does not mean that you should leave. You should talk to the police, tell them what you saw, because that's evidence. And as a prosecutor, we also have a duty to look at the evidence. And if there's only one piece, it is to be favorable to the suspect. So the more pieces of information that we have, the more pieces of evidence, that means every single witness's statements actually matters. So we want to make sure you direct, right? Assess your safety first, say something, stand with that person, tell that person it's not okay. And you want to document, make sure to get all of the photos, all of those things to police officers. Working in community, we've heard throughout today, many of the speakers talking about, practical ways of being there and standing up for community, whether it's working in concert to take our elders out so they're not alone, so they don't feel that they're sequestered in their home, so they don't have to operate in fear. And as allies, to recognize that one harm against you is one harm against me, and that we stand together. And I want to let everyone know that this Queer Latina stands for you, and so does our office. So thank you so much for all of your work.
Thank you, Sochi. And I know we're just wrapping up here. I want to make space for Michael and Angela if you have any last thoughts especially about prevention and deterrence and how we can help protect and prevent the harm. Michael, I saw you on mute first, and then we'll give Angela the last word before I close this out.
Okay, just very quickly. I think it's very important. I think this community is organized, and the people participating in this discussion are sensitive to the issues, but other aspects of the government and law enforcement are not, to the effect that we've recognized how obviously racist using terms like China virus were in the previous administration, but the Justice Department still has an economic espionage program called the China Initiative that unfairly stigmatizes Chinese scientists and Chinese American academics and technologists all across the United States. And the Brennan Center is working with United Chinese Americans, Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and APA Justice Task Force to bring awareness to how that unfair national security stigmatization of people because of their ancestral or otherwise connection to China is again increasing this anti-Asian animus in a different context, in a national security context. So I think, I just want to bring more awareness to how all of our government officials phrasing problems in a way that cause this harm needs to be called out and addressed and corrected.
And my kind of closing remarks I'd like to say is that, it's been a little bit hard to see that the response to anti-API violence from some policymakers at the state and federal level is just to relay more resources and more power to law enforcement. That's what's happening at the state level. The vast majority bills are focused on having law enforcement collect data and receive it when most community members are likely afraid to report to law enforcement for a variety of reasons, or the incident isn't appropriate for law enforcement. And what we are asking for really is for resources for prevention, right, as you talked about, Chesa, and services to victims. And that's not what the vast majority of state and federal bills do. And so just one bill to lift up that we are working on that I think goes against that current is AB 886. AB 886, and that is with Assemblymember Chu. We actually originally developed this bill with then Assemblymember Bonda, who's now our AG. And what this bill would do is that it would provide mental health services funding to community-based organizations to provide language accessible, culturally competent mental health services, which is sorely lacking for our communities. It also would provide grant funding for community-based organizations to provide restorative justice programming, right? So that if the all the parties involved voluntarily want to participate, they can, and in a series of sessions that really focuses on repairing the harm caused to the victim, right, which is something that's often not focused on when we go through the criminal legal process. And I want to thank you, Chesa, for co-authoring or co-sponsoring this bill, really without us even asking, and kind of knowing that this is what the community needs, that we need services, we need prevention, right? And so that's our ask for the Asian Law Caucus. Thank you.
Absolutely, Angela. I'm really proud to be a co-sponsor. It's such an important piece of legislation, and it brings together a diverse group of community and elected officials to advocate for the changes that we need to be safe. We're a little bit over time now. I just really want to offer a tremendous and heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists. It was a nuanced, it was a deep, it was a complicated discussion. I also want to thank the hundreds of folks who stayed with us all the way through as we dug into the weeds of the challenging legal and law enforcement and community issues that we need to improve and to make San Francisco and all of our communities better, safer, more secure. We know, and I think this conversation has made clear, that the interpersonal and systemic racism continues to plague our communities. My office, my team, and I are dedicated now more than ever to working with our allies and our partners to combat hate, to seek long-term solutions, to prevent and protect and to heal, and to make sure that San Francisco is safer than it's ever been for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.